Right now, in your hand, or on your nightstand, or somewhere nearby, there is a small glass rectangle. And inside that rectangle, there are more transistors, more tiny electrical switches than there are grains of sand on most beaches you've ever walked on. Something like 15 or 20 billion of them, each one so small that a human hair would look like a redwood tree beside it. And every single one of those switches is doing the simplest thing imaginable. It's turning on, or it's turning off. That's all. On or off. Yes or no. 1 or 0. And from that, from nothing but patterns of electrical current flowing or not flowing through microscopic channels carved into silicon, comes everything. Every photograph you've ever taken, every message you've ever sent, every video, every song, every map, every search, every face-to-face call across 10,000 miles. All of it built from switches flipping on and off, billions of times per second, in a piece of refined sand the size of your thumbnail. And here's the thing that should stop you for a moment if you really sit with it. Nobody invented this all at once. Nobody sat down and designed the modern computer from scratch. What actually happened is stranger and more beautiful than that. What actually happened is a conversation that stretches across centuries, across continents, across languages, between people who never met, who often never even heard of each other. One person asked a question they couldn't answer. Decades later, sometimes a full century later, someone else picked up that unanswered question and found a piece of the answer. And in doing so, they left behind a new question of their own. And then someone else picked up that one. This conversation has been going on for over 1,000 years. An Arab mathematician in 9th century Baghdad asked a question that a British countess in Victorian England would try to answer. A self-taught English logician in the 1850s asked a question that a 21-year-old engineering student at MIT would answer 83 years later. A young British mathematician in 1936, working alone in his room at Cambridge, answered a question posed by a German professor in 1900, and in doing so, he accidentally invented the theoretical foundation for every computer that has ever existed or ever will exist, all without building a single machine. And that same young mathematician left behind a question of his own, a question we still cannot fully answer tonight, almost 90 years later. Can a machine think? That's the story we're going to walk through tonight. Not as a list of inventions, not as a timeline of dates and names, but as a conversation. A long, slow, extraordinary conversation between curious people across the centuries, each one answering a question they inherited from someone who came before, and each one leaving behind a new question for someone who wouldn't arrive for years or decades or generations. And the reason this conversation matters to you, right now, tonight, is that you are living inside its consequences. The device playing this recording exists because of this conversation. The network that delivered it to you exists because of this conversation. The algorithms that recommended it, the software that decodes the audio, the screen that displayed the thumbnail, all of it traces back to specific moments when one person answered another person's unanswered question. You are surrounded, at every moment of your modern life, by the accumulated answers of hundreds of people across 1,000 years of asking. So here's what I want you to think about as we begin. How did we get from scratching marks into bone to machines that seem to understand language? How did we get from counting sheep on our fingers to artificial intelligence? And was it inevitable? Was there something built into the logic of the universe that guaranteed we'd end up here, with thinking machines in our pockets? Or was it fragile, contingent, dependent on specific people asking specific questions at specific moments, any one of whom might never have been born? And maybe the deepest question of all, the one that has been sitting quietly at the heart of this conversation since the very beginning, since before anyone even knew the conversation was happening. Is there a limit? Is there a boundary to what these machines can do? And if there is, where is it? And how would we know if we'd reached it? Let's find out. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of computers, because computers came surprisingly late. The beginning of the conversation itself. The first time a human being looked at the chaos of the world and thought, there must be a pattern in here, and if I can find it, maybe I can make a machine find it too. Let's start with fingers. The word digit means two things, and the fact that it means two things tells you almost everything you need to know about how this story begins. A digit is a number, 0 through 9. A digit is also a finger. The Latin word digitus meant finger, and the reason we count in tens, the reason a base 10 number system feels so natural and obvious to every child who learns it, is simply that most humans have 10 fingers. If we had evolved with 8 fingers, we would count in base 8, and it would feel just as natural. Our entire system of representing quantity is, at bottom, an accident of anatomy, and for a very long time, that was enough. If you were a shepherd in ancient Mesopotamia, watching your flock come in through a gate at dusk, you could count on your fingers and know whether all your animals had returned. If you had more than 10, you could use your toes. If you had more than 20, well, you had a problem. And this is where the conversation begins. Not with a question anyone wrote down or spoke aloud, but with a feeling. The feeling of reaching the limits of your own body as a counting tool. The feeling of needing something outside yourself to hold a number, to remember it, to carry it forward in time, so you didn't have to keep it in your head. The earliest known response to that feeling is almost heartbreakingly simple. It's a bone. A baboon fibula, found near the headwaters of the Nile in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, dating back roughly 20,000 years. It's called the Ishango Bone, and it has a series of notches carved into it in distinct groups. There has been a lot of scholarly debate about what those notches mean. Some researchers think it's a tally stick, someone keeping count of something, maybe days, maybe traded goods, maybe kills. Others have argued it might be a lunar calendar. Some have even suggested the groupings correspond to prime numbers, though that's contentious. But here's what we know for certain. 20,000 years ago, someone felt the need to take a number out of their head and put it into the world. They externalized counting. They scratched marks into bone so they wouldn't have to remember. And in that small act, the conversation began. Because what that person was really doing, though they had no way of knowing it, was asking the first question in the history of computing. Can we make thinking easier by offloading it onto something outside ourselves? The answer, 20,000 years later, is yes. Every computer ever built is a descendant of that scratched bone.
Every spreadsheet, every database, every search engine is, at bottom, a tool for holding information so a human mind doesn't have to. But the Ishango bone could only hold numbers. It couldn't do anything with them. It was storage without processing. It was memory without thought. To get from there to something that could actually manipulate numbers, calculate with them, transform inputs into outputs, humanity needed something more sophisticated, and it took a few thousand years to arrive. The abacus shows up in Mesopotamia somewhere around 2700 to 2300 years before the Common Era, though the word itself comes from the Greek abax, meaning a flat surface or a counting board. The basic idea is beautiful in its simplicity. Beads or stones slide along rods or grooves. Their position represents a value. Move a bead on the ones rod, that's 1. Fill up the ones rod, reset it, and move a bead on the tens rod. You are physically manipulating place value with your hands. And here's what makes the abacus more than just a tally stick. It's not just a way to record numbers. It's a way to calculate with them. A skilled abacus operator can add, subtract, multiply, and divide with remarkable speed. In Japan, there are competitions where soroban practitioners go head-to-head against people using electronic calculators, and the abacus users sometimes win. Not because the abacus is faster than electronics, obviously, but because the human trained on the abacus has internalized the operations so deeply that their fingers move almost before their conscious mind has processed the problem. The tool reshapes the mind. That idea that computing tools don't just help us think, but actually change how we think, is going to come back again and again throughout this story. It's one of the deepest threads in the whole conversation. Different cultures developed their own versions of the abacus. The Chinese xuanpan, with its distinctive 2 and 5 bead arrangement. The Japanese soroban, streamlined to 1 and 4. The Russian scotty, with 10 beads per rod. Each one reflects a slightly different mathematical tradition, but the core idea is the same. And these weren't curiosities or toys. For centuries, if you were a merchant or a tax collector or an engineer planning an irrigation system, the abacus was your computer. And I mean that literally. The word computer for most of its history meant a person who computes. And those people used tools like the abacus to do their work. But let's pause here and think about what the abacus cannot do, because its limitations are just as important as its capabilities. The abacus is a wonderful tool for arithmetic, but it has no memory in any meaningful sense. When you finish a calculation and clear the beads, the work is gone. There is no way to store a sequence of operations. No way to say, do this, then do that, then do the other thing, and have the tool carry it out. Every step requires a human hand and a human mind directing it. The abacus is a calculator. It helps you compute. But it doesn't compute on its own. The gap between a tool that helps you calculate and a machine that can follow a sequence of instructions by itself, that gap is enormous. It took humanity thousands of years to cross it, and the path toward crossing it came from an unexpected direction, not from counting or arithmetic or commerce, from the stars. Astronomy was one of the great mathematical obsessions of the ancient and medieval worlds, and with good reason. If you're a sailor, you navigate by the stars. If you're a farmer, you need to know when seasons change. If you're a priest in almost any ancient culture, the movements of celestial bodies are tied to religious practice and prophecy. And calculating the positions of planets and stars is hard. It involves multiplying and dividing very large numbers, working with angles and trigonometric functions, doing the same kinds of calculations over and over with slightly different inputs. It's tedious, error-prone work, and the consequences of getting it wrong could be lethal. A navigator who miscalculates his position might sail his ship onto rocks. This pressure, the pressure to do complex calculations accurately and repeatably, drove enormous innovation. The astrolabe, which appears in the Greek world around the 2nd century before the Common Era and was refined extensively by Islamic scholars during the medieval period, is essentially an analog computer for astronomy. A beautiful brass disc with rotating plates and pointers that lets you model the positions of the sun and stars for any given time and latitude. You dial in your inputs by rotating the parts, and you read off the outputs from the engraved scales. It's solving spherical trigonometry problems mechanically, without requiring the user to do the underlying math. An astrolabe doesn't look anything like what we think of as a computer. But functionally, it's doing the same thing, taking inputs, processing them through a fixed set of relationships, producing outputs. And then there's the Antikythera mechanism, which is one of my favorite stories in all of engineering history. In 1901, Greek sponge divers working off the coast of a tiny island between Crete and the Peloponnese discovered a Roman-era shipwreck. Among the corroded statues and pottery, they found a lump of greenish, calcified metal about the size of a shoebox. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for decades, mostly ignored because nobody could figure out what it was. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, a British science historian named Derek de Solla Price started taking it seriously. He used X-ray imaging to peer inside the corroded mass, and what he found was astonishing. A complex system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, with teeth cut at precise intervals, all designed to mesh together in specific ratios. It was a mechanical computer for predicting astronomical events. You turned a hand crank on the side, and the gears calculated the positions of the sun and moon, predicted lunar and solar eclipses, and even tracked the cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. It dated to roughly 100 years before the Common Era, and the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Some of the gears had teeth barely a 25th of an inch apart, cut with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. Over 2,000 years ago, someone in the Greek world, we still don't know exactly who, though there are theories connecting the mechanism to the tradition of Archimedes or to workshops on the island of Rhodes, someone built a machine that could model the heavens mechanically. You gave it an input, essentially a date, by turning a crank, and the gears computed the state of the sky. It had multiple output dials, each displaying different information: the position of the sun, the phase of the moon, the timing of eclipses. It even had a kind of user manual inscribed on its surfaces, explaining how to read the dials. It was, by any reasonable definition, an analog computer. And then, the knowledge of how to build such things was lost. Remember the question we started with tonight: whether the path from bone scratches to thinking machines was inevitable, or whether it was fragile and contingent. Here is part of the answer. The Roman world didn't carry the tradition forward, or if they did, nothing survived. The medieval European world certainly had nothing comparable for centuries. And that is one of the sobering lessons of this story. Progress is not a straight line. Knowledge can vanish. Techniques can be forgotten. The Antikythera mechanism is a ghost from a future that didn't happen on schedule, a reminder that the history of computing could have gone very differently. But the impulse never died. The need to calculate, to predict, to model the world in numbers kept reasserting itself across cultures and centuries. And in 9th century Baghdad, a mathematician named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi was about to give the conversation one of its most important words. Al-Khwarizmi worked at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the great intellectual center of the Abbasid Caliphate, a place where scholars from across the known world gathered to translate, study, and extend the works of Greek, Indian, and Persian thinkers. Baghdad in the 9th century was one of the largest cities in the world, a cosmopolitan hub of learning and commerce, and the House of Wisdom was its intellectual heart. Al-Khwarizmi worked alongside astronomers, translators, geographers, and mathematicians, and his own work drew on traditions from multiple cultures. He wrote a treatise on solving equations, a book whose Arabic title included the phrase algebra, meaning the reunion of broken parts, which referred to the technique of moving terms from one side of an equation to the other. That word, algebra, became algebra in Latin and then in every European language. The book itself, laid out systematic, step-by-step methods for finding unknown quantities.
His methods were so clear, so procedural, that they could almost be followed mechanically. Take this number, perform this operation, take the result, feed it into the next step, repeat until you arrive at the answer. This is algorithmic thinking. And the word algorithm itself comes from the Latinized version of al-Khwarizmi's name. He didn't invent the concept of step-by-step procedures. Those had existed in mathematics for millennia. Euclid's algorithm for finding the greatest common divisor dates back over 2,000 years. But al-Khwarizmi codified the approach in a way that would echo through centuries. His algebra, from the Arabic al-jabr, meaning the reunion of broken parts, became one of the foundational tools of mathematics. And the idea that complex problems could be broken down into sequences of simple, repeatable operations, that idea is one of the crucial intellectual ingredients that would eventually make true computing possible.
So by the end of the medieval period, the conversation had produced several important pieces. Tools for recording numbers, tools for calculating with numbers, mechanical devices that could model complex systems, and the idea that reasoning itself might be reducible to step-by-step procedures. But all of these still required a human at every step, a human to turn the crank, to slide the beads, to follow the procedure. Nobody had yet imagined a machine that could receive a set of instructions and then carry them out automatically, one after another, without a human hand guiding each individual step. That idea, the idea of a programmable machine, was about to come from the most unlikely of places. Not from mathematics, not from astronomy, from weaving. Lyon, France, in the late 1700s, was the silk capital of Europe. The city's entire economy revolved around weaving, and the most prized fabrics were brocades, those incredibly intricate patterned silks with images of flowers, birds, and landscapes woven directly into the cloth. They were stunning, and they were brutally difficult to make. To produce a complex pattern, you needed a device called a draw loom, and operating a draw loom required two people. The weaver sat at the loom and threw the shuttle back and forth. But above, often perched on top of the loom itself, sat a second person, usually a young boy called a draw boy. The draw boy's job was to pull specific sets of threads upward at exactly the right moment, so the shuttle would pass over some threads and under others, creating the pattern. Every single row of the fabric required the draw boy to pull a different combination of threads, and a complex brocade might have thousands of rows, each one different. The draw boy had to follow instructions, usually called out to him or read from a paper chart. And he had to get it right every time. One mistake, one wrong thread pulled, and the pattern would have a visible flaw. You can imagine how slow and error-prone this was. The draw boys were often children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9, working all day in cramped positions on top of the looms. It was exhausting, tedious work, and the whole process was expensive because you essentially needed 2 skilled workers for every loom. Several inventors had tried to automate the draw boy's job before. Basile Bouchon had experimented with perforated paper tape as early as 1725. Jacques de Vaucanson, famous for building astonishing automata, including a mechanical duck that appeared to eat and digest grain, had built a partially automated loom in the 1740s using a metal cylinder with holes punched in it, like a music box. But Vaucanson's loom was expensive, fragile, and never really caught on. The person who solved the problem was Joseph-Marie Jacquard, born in 1752, the son of a weaver. He knew the trade from the inside. He'd watched the draw boys struggle. He understood the economics, and he spent years tinkering. His key innovation, which he demonstrated publicly around 1804, was a system of sturdy pasteboard cards, stiff rectangular cards with holes punched in specific positions. Each card controlled one row of the pattern. The cards were laced together in a long chain, and as the loom operated, the cards would advance one by one over a mechanism at the top of the loom. Where there was a hole in the card, a hook could pass through and lift a thread. Where the card was solid, the hook was blocked, and the thread stayed down. Think about what that means. The pattern was encoded in the cards. You could change the entire design just by swapping in a different set of cards.
The same loom could weave flowers one day and geometric patterns the next. And the loom was reading instructions from an external medium. The cards were a program. The loom was a machine that executed that program automatically, step by step, without a human deciding at each moment what to do. The draw boy had been replaced by cardboard. This is a genuinely profound conceptual leap, even though Jacquard himself almost certainly didn't think of it in those grand terms. He was a practical man, a weaver's son, trying to make weaving faster and cheaper. He wasn't trying to invent the idea of programmable machinery. He was trying to put draw boys out of work, which sounds harsher than he probably meant it, but the economic logic was overwhelming. And there's something worth pausing on here, because it touches a theme that runs through the entire history of computing. Every time a machine automates a task that humans used to do, there's a period of upheaval. The draw boys lost their jobs.
The weavers of Lyon rioted, and there are accounts of Jacquard looms being publicly burned. But the technology spread anyway, because it could do the work faster, cheaper, and with fewer errors. This same pattern, automation displacing workers, resistance, disruption, eventual adaptation, would replay with every major advance in computing. From the human computers replaced by ENIAC, to the typists replaced by word processors, to the factory workers replaced by robotic assembly lines, to the drivers and translators and artists who now wonder whether AI will replace them. Jacquard's loom was, in a sense, the first act of a drama that is still unfolding. But the biggest ideas often enter the world sideways, through practical problems, carried by people who are just trying to make something work a little better and have no conception of the implications. The Jacquard loom was a massive commercial success.
By 1812, there were something like 11,000 of them operating in France. The silk weavers of Lyon initially rioted against the machines, fearing for their livelihoods, and honestly, they weren't wrong to be worried, because the looms did eliminate the draw boy's job entirely. But the technology spread anyway, because the economics were overwhelming. And there's a detail I want you to carry with you, because it's going to matter in a moment. One of the most famous demonstrations of the Jacquard loom's capability was a woven portrait of Jacquard himself, produced around 1839. This portrait used approximately 24,000 cards to encode the image. 24,000 rows of instructions, each one specifying exactly which threads to raise and which to leave down, producing a woven image so detailed it looked almost like an engraving. A man named Charles Babbage owned one of these portraits. He hung it in his drawing room in London, and he used it to explain his ideas to visitors. Because Babbage had seen something in Jacquard's loom that almost nobody else had noticed. If punched cards could tell a machine which threads to lift, why couldn't punched cards tell a machine which mathematical operations to perform? Charles Babbage was born in London in 1791, the son of a wealthy banker, and from an early age he was consumed by a very specific frustration. He hated errors in mathematical tables. This might sound like a minor obsession, but in the early 19th century, mathematical tables were critical infrastructure. Navigation, astronomy, engineering, insurance, taxation, all of it depended on printed tables of logarithms, trigonometric functions, and astronomical positions. And these tables were riddled with mistakes. They were calculated by hand, by teams of human computers, and then typeset by hand and printed. Errors crept in at every stage.
A navigator at sea using a faulty logarithm table could miscalculate his position and wreck his ship on rocks. People died because of errors in mathematical tables. The problem was real. Babbage wanted to eliminate those errors by mechanizing the entire process. Not just the calculation, but the printing too, so there would be no chance of a typesetting mistake. Around 1822, he conceived of a machine he called the difference engine. The core idea was based on a mathematical technique called the method of finite differences, which lets you compute polynomial functions using only addition. You don't need multiplication or division, just repeated addition. And addition is relatively easy to mechanize with gears. Each gear wheel represents a digit, and when one wheel completes a full rotation, it carries over to the next wheel, like an odometer in a car.
He built a small working demonstration model, and it was impressive enough that the British government agreed to fund the construction of a full-scale version. This was 1823, and the government eventually invested around £17,000, an enormous sum at the time, equivalent to the cost of building a couple of warships. But the project ran into terrible difficulties. Babbage was a perfectionist of the most agonizing kind. The precision required for the gears and linkages was at the absolute edge of what 19th century manufacturing could achieve. Every gear wheel had to mesh with its neighbors with extraordinary accuracy, because errors compounded through the mechanism, and a machine designed to eliminate computational errors could not afford to introduce mechanical ones. Babbage kept changing the design, demanding tighter tolerances, redesigning components that had already been built.
He argued bitterly with his chief engineer, Joseph Clement, a brilliant toolmaker who was himself a perfectionist, but who understandably resented having finished work discarded because Babbage had thought of a better approach. The relationship between them deteriorated. The project dragged on for years. Costs ballooned far beyond the original estimates, and around 1833, the British government, having already spent the equivalent of building 2 warships, pulled the plug. The difference engine was never completed in Babbage's lifetime. Babbage was also, by all accounts, a difficult man to work with and to live near. He waged a famous years-long campaign against street musicians, whom he considered a menace to intellectual work. He published pamphlets. He lobbied Parliament. He confronted organ grinders personally in the streets of London. The organ grinders responded by following him home and playing outside his windows. This is the man who conceived the computer. Brilliant, obsessive, quarrelsome, and at war with street music. But here's where the story takes a turn that matters enormously for the conversation. By the time the difference engine project collapsed, Babbage had already conceived of something far more ambitious. Something that, if he'd been able to build it, would have been recognizable as a genuine, general-purpose computer, more than a century before the first electronic computers existed. He called it the analytical engine. And this is where Jacquard's punched cards come roaring back into the story. The analytical engine, which Babbage worked on from roughly 1834 until his death in 1871, was designed to be programmed using punched cards, directly inspired by the Jacquard loom. But where Jacquard's cards controlled which threads to lift, Babbage's cards would control mathematical operations. He envisioned 2 types of cards: operation cards, which told the machine what to do, add, subtract, multiply, divide, and variable cards, which told the machine where to find the numbers to operate on and where to store the results. The machine would have a store, which was essentially memory, a set of columns of gear wheels holding numbers,
and it would have a mill, which was the processing unit where arithmetic actually happened. Numbers would be transferred from the store to the mill, operated on according to the instructions on the cards, and the results sent back to the store. If this sounds familiar, it should. A store and a mill, memory and a processor, input through punched cards, the ability to perform any arithmetic operation in any sequence. Babbage had designed in brass and clockwork the fundamental architecture that all modern computers share. He even envisioned conditional branching. The machine could be designed to skip forward or backward in its sequence of cards, depending on the result of a calculation. If a number was positive, do one thing. If negative, do another. And conditional branching is what makes a computer fundamentally different from a calculator. A calculator does what you tell it, step by step. A computer can make decisions. But Babbage could never build it. Victorian engineering simply wasn't precise enough. The gears needed tolerances that the manufacturing techniques of his era couldn't reliably produce. The analytical engine existed only in his incredibly detailed plans and drawings, thousands of pages of them. It was a beautiful dream, locked inside notebooks that would gather dust for decades. And now we need to talk about Ada Lovelace, because the conversation doesn't stop with Babbage. He asked a question. Can a machine perform any mathematical operation if given the right instructions? He answered it in principle, on paper, with his design. But he left behind a deeper question that he himself hadn't fully grasped. And it was Ada Lovelace who saw it. Augusta Ada King, Countess of Lovelace, was born in 1815, the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet. She never knew her father. Her mother, Lady Byron, was terrified that Ada might inherit Byron's wild, romantic temperament and pushed her toward mathematics and science as a kind of antidote. It worked, in a way that Lady Byron probably didn't anticipate. Ada turned out to be brilliant at mathematics, but she was also deeply imaginative and creative in her thinking. And that combination, the mathematical rigor and the poetic vision, turned out to be exactly what the conversation needed at that moment. Ada met Babbage at a party in 1833 when she was 17. She saw a demonstration of his difference engine and was immediately fascinated.
Over the following years, she became deeply involved in understanding the analytical engine. In 1842, an Italian mathematician named Luigi Menabrea published a description of the analytical engine based on lectures Babbage had given in Turin. Ada translated this paper from French into English, and at Babbage's encouragement, she added her own notes. Those notes ended up being about 3 times longer than the original paper. What Ada wrote in those notes is extraordinary. She described, step by step, how the analytical engine could be instructed to compute Bernoulli numbers, a complex mathematical sequence. She laid out the operations the machine would need to perform, the order in which they should happen, and how intermediate results should be stored and reused. This is widely considered the first computer program ever written, and it was written for a machine that didn't exist by a woman in 1843. Working by candlelight in a world of horse-drawn carriages and gas lamps. But what's even more remarkable than the program itself is the conceptual clarity Ada brought to the discussion. She understood something that even Babbage hadn't fully articulated. She saw that the analytical engine wasn't really about arithmetic. She wrote that the engine could manipulate not just numbers, but any symbols that followed rules. It could, in principle, compose music or create graphics if those things could be represented symbolically. She was imagining a general-purpose symbol processing machine. That's essentially what every computer is. And she also wrote something that would echo across the next 150 years of the conversation. She said the engine had no pretensions to originate anything. It could only do whatever we know how to order it to perform. The machine could follow instructions. It could not create anything genuinely new on its own. This is Ada Lovelace's question, the one she left behind for the conversation. And it's a question that still burns today, in the age of GPT and DALL-E, and all the other systems that seem to generate creative output. Can a machine only do what we tell it to do? Or can it somehow originate something? Ada died of cancer in 1852, at just 36. Babbage kept working on the analytical engine until his own death in 1871, but he never built it. The plans gathered dust. The world moved on. And for decades, the significance of what Babbage and Lovelace had envisioned was largely forgotten. But the punched card didn't disappear. It found a new champion and a new purpose, not in England but in America. And the question it would help answer wasn't a theoretical one about the nature of computation. It was brutally practical. The United States government needed to count its people, and it was running out of time. By the 1880s, the United States had a problem. The country was growing so fast that the census, the constitutionally mandated count of every person in the nation, was becoming an administrative catastrophe. The 1880 census had taken nearly 8 years to fully tabulate. Projections suggested the 1890 census might not be finished before the 1900 census was due to begin. Armies of clerks sat in vast rooms, tallying marks in ledger books by hand, and the work was agonizingly slow. A young engineer at the Census Bureau named Herman Hollerith understood the problem firsthand. He'd worked on the 1880 census, sitting in those rooms full of clerks, watching them tally and retally the same numbers week after week, month after month, making mistakes, losing count, falling behind. The experience left an impression.
He later said the inspiration for his solution came from watching a train conductor punch tickets. Each conductor had a hole punch, and they'd punch holes in specific positions on a passenger's ticket to record characteristics like gender, hair color, and build, so conductors further down the line could verify the passenger's identity. Holes in specific positions, encoding specific information. Hollerith recognized the principle immediately, and he had an idea that borrowed directly from Jacquard's loom, though he applied it in a completely new way. Hollerith's insight was to use punched cards not as instructions for a machine, but as data storage. Each card would represent one person. The holes punched into that card would encode information about that person: age, sex, state of residence, occupation, marital status. A hole in one position might mean male. A hole in another might mean born in New York.
And then you'd feed that card into a machine, a tabulating machine, that would read the holes using small metal pins. Each pin would press down against the card, and wherever there was a hole, the pin would pass through and make contact with a small cup of mercury underneath, completing an electrical circuit. That electrical signal would advance a mechanical counter by 1. Instead of clerks tallying marks for months and years, you could feed cards through a machine and have it count automatically. And you could sort the cards too. Hollerith designed a sorting box that would pop open the correct compartment based on what the card said, so you could physically separate cards into categories and run them through again for more detailed analysis. The results were spectacular. The 1890 census, using Hollerith's machines, was tabulated in roughly 2 years. What had taken nearly 8 years by hand was done in a quarter of the time. And for the first time, the government could do things with the data that had been impossible before. They could cross-tabulate. They could ask questions like, how many married women over 40 live in Ohio and work in manufacturing? Before Hollerith, answering a question like that would have meant going through millions of records by hand. Now you could sort the cards, run them through the machine, and have your answer in hours. And the machines didn't just count faster, they opened up entirely new categories of questions. Before Hollerith, you could ask, how many people live in each state? That was a straightforward tally. But now you could ask compound questions that would have been impractical to answer by hand. How many foreign-born men between 30 and 40 work in agriculture in states west of the Mississippi? You'd sort the cards by birthplace, filter by age, filter by occupation, filter by state, and run the results through the tabulating machine.
Each pass through the machine answered a layer of the question. This was, in a rudimentary way, the beginning of data analysis. Not just counting, but querying, asking structured questions of structured data and getting precise answers. Hollerith went on to found a company called the Tabulating Machine Company to sell his machines to governments and businesses around the world. That company, through a series of mergers in 1911, became the Computing Tabulating Recording Company. And in 1924, under the leadership of Thomas J. Watson Sr., it was renamed International Business Machines, IBM. IBM would dominate the computing industry for the next half-century, and the punched card that Jacquard invented to control a loom, that Babbage imagined using to program a computer, that Hollerith adapted to store census data, would remain the primary medium for interacting with computers well into the 1970s. If you worked in a large organization between 1950 and 1975, chances are you encountered punched cards. Paychecks were calculated on them. University grades were recorded on them. There are people alive today who learned to program by carefully punching holes in stiff paper cards, stacking them in precise order, carrying the stack to a card reader, feeding them into the machine, and then waiting, sometimes for hours, to see if the program ran correctly. If you dropped your stack of cards on the way to the card reader and they scattered across the floor, you might spend the rest of the day putting them back in order. This was programming in the age of punched cards, and it required a very specific kind of patience. But Hollerith's machines, impressive as they were, still weren't computers in the modern sense. They could count and sort, but they couldn't make decisions. They couldn't branch. They couldn't follow a sequence of instructions that changed depending on intermediate results. They were powerful tabulators, but they were not universal machines. To get from tabulating machines to true computers, the conversation needed to take a detour through pure mathematics. Because before anyone could build a thinking machine, someone needed to answer a more fundamental question. A question that had nothing to do with gears or electricity or punched cards. A question about the nature of logic itself. Can thinking follow mathematical rules? That question had been lurking in the background for centuries. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician who co-invented calculus in the 17th century, had dreamed of what he called a characteristica universalis, a universal language of reasoning, and a calculus ratiocinator, a calculus of thought, that would allow any dispute to be settled by calculation.
Two philosophers in disagreement would sit down, pick up their pens and say, "Let us calculate." The answer would emerge mechanically from the symbols, indisputable because it was produced by mathematical rules rather than human opinion. Leibniz believed this with the passionate conviction of someone who had lived through the devastation of the 30 Years' War and craved a world where reason could replace violence as the arbiter of disputes. Leibniz even built a mechanical calculator called the stepped reckoner, a beautiful device of brass gears and cylinders that could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. He demonstrated it before the Royal Society in London. But the machine only handled arithmetic. It couldn't do logic. Leibniz couldn't formalize the messy, ambiguous process of human reasoning into precise mathematical operations. He knew it should be possible. He believed it deeply. But he couldn't find the way. He died in 1716, and his dream of a calculus of thought remained exactly that, a dream, an unanswered question left floating in the intellectual atmosphere of Europe for the next century and a half. 200 years later, a self-taught English mathematician picked it up. George Boole was born in 1815 in Lincoln, England. His father was a shoemaker with a passion for science and mathematics, and Boole largely educated himself, teaching school to support his family while studying mathematics in his spare time. He never attended university as a student, but his work was so impressive that he was eventually appointed Professor of Mathematics at Queen's College in Cork, Ireland. In 1854, Boole published a book with a title that sounds dry, but whose contents would reshape the world. He called it An Investigation of the Laws of Thought, and in it, he proposed something radical. You could do logic with mathematics, not arithmetic, not geometry.
Pure logical reasoning. True and false could be treated as numbers, 1 and 0. And, or, and not could be treated as operations, like addition and subtraction. You could write logical statements as equations and solve them using algebraic rules. This might sound obvious now, in a world built on digital logic. But in 1854, it was genuinely revolutionary. Think about what Boole was claiming. He was saying that the process of logical reasoning, the process you use when you think, if it's raining and I don't have an umbrella, then I will get wet. That process could be captured in an equation. You could write it down as symbols and manipulate it using algebraic rules, just as you'd manipulate numbers. And the answer you'd get would be logically correct, guaranteed by the mathematics, regardless of whether you understood the underlying content. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose A means it is raining, and B means I have an umbrella. In Boolean algebra, A and B means both conditions are true simultaneously. A or B means at least one is true. Not A means it is not raining. You can combine these operations to build complex logical statements, and you can simplify them using algebraic rules that Boole worked out. The entire apparatus of formal logic, syllogisms, deductions, proofs, could be reduced to manipulating symbols according to rules. Boole had discovered that thought itself, or at least the part of thought that involves deduction, inference, and logical reasoning, might follow mathematical rules. Reasoning could potentially be mechanized. Not just arithmetic, not just calculation, but the process of logical thinking itself. And then, having provided this partial answer, Boole left behind the next question in the conversation. If logical reasoning can be expressed as mathematics, can it be performed by a machine? Boole himself never pursued this direction. He was a pure mathematician, working with pencil and paper, unconcerned with building physical devices. He died in 1864, at just 49, reportedly from pneumonia contracted after walking to work in a rainstorm and then lecturing in wet clothes. And for decades, his algebra of logic sat in the mathematical journals, looking interesting but not obviously useful to anyone building anything. 83 years is a long time for an idea to wait for its practical application. Most ideas don't survive that kind of dormancy. They get forgotten, superseded, relegated to footnotes. But Boolean algebra was preserved in the mathematical literature, passed from teacher to student, included in textbooks as an elegant curiosity, a beautiful piece of pure mathematics with no known practical use. It was waiting, though nobody knew it was waiting, for the moment when someone would connect it to the physical world. 83 years would pass before someone connected Boole's abstract mathematics to the physical world of electrical circuits.
And that connection would come from one of the most improbable sources imaginable, a 21-year-old graduate student's master's thesis. Claude Shannon grew up in Gaylord, Michigan, a small town where he built model planes, a telegraph system from his house to a friend's, and a barbed wire fence that doubled as a telegraph line. He was tinkering from the start. He went to the University of Michigan for his bachelor's degree, studying both electrical engineering and mathematics, a combination that would turn out to be fateful. And then he went to MIT for his master's. At MIT, Shannon worked with a massive electromechanical computer called the differential analyzer, a room-sized machine built by Vannevar Bush that could solve differential equations using a complex system of gears, shafts, and wheels. The machine was controlled by a network of electrical relays, switches that could be either open or closed, on or off. And Shannon, sitting there in the 1930s, maintaining and operating this machine, noticed something that nobody else had put together. Electrical switches have two states, open or closed, on or off. George Boole's logic has two values, true or false, 1 or 0. They're the same thing. Shannon's 1937 master's thesis, written when he was 21, is sometimes called the most important master's thesis of the 20th century. In it, he showed that you could arrange electrical switches in series to get AND behavior. Both switches must be closed for current to flow. You could arrange them in parallel to get OR behavior. Either switch being closed would let current flow. And you could use an inverter to get NOT, flipping the output. He proved that any logical or arithmetic operation could be built from combinations of these basic arrangements. This was the moment when abstract mathematics became engineering. Shannon had answered Boole's unanswered question. Yes, logic can be performed by a machine. Any machine that has switches with two states, on or off, can perform Boolean logic. And if it can perform Boolean logic, it can, in principle, perform any logical operation, any calculation, anything that can be expressed as a sequence of true or false decisions. Shannon had built a bridge. On one side stood 83 years of abstract algebra that nobody had found a practical use for. George Boole, working alone in Cork, Ireland, in the 1850s, manipulating symbols on paper, dreaming of a calculus of thought, and then dying before the invention of the telephone, let alone the computer. On the other side stood a world increasingly full of electrical switches, relays clicking on and off in telephone exchanges and control systems across the country, with nobody connecting them to formal logic. Shannon stood in the middle and said, "These are the same thing. Your switches are Boole's algebra made physical. Your circuits are logic gates. Your relay networks are mathematical equations, and once you see that connection, you can design circuits the way you design equations. You can optimize them. You can prove that they'll work correctly before you build them. You can build complexity systematically, layer by layer, using mathematical tools that have been refined for decades." Everything that followed, every digital computer, every smartphone, every server, every chip, every bit of software, rests on Shannon's bridge. The most remarkable aspect of Shannon's thesis might be its timing. He was 21. He was writing a master's thesis. The paper that arguably founded the digital age was a homework assignment. Shannon himself seemed almost amused by how important his work turned out to be. He moved on quickly to other problems, most notably his 1948 theory of information, and he never exhibited the kind of proprietary attachment to his ideas that many scientists display. When asked about the significance of his thesis, he would shrug and say that the connection between Boolean algebra and circuits had been floating in the air, and that if he hadn't made it, someone else would have. Maybe, but nobody else did. Shannon's thesis answered part of the question about whether logic could be made physical. It showed that logic could be done with switches, but it didn't address the deeper question of what switches could actually compute. Was there a limit?
Could a machine made of switches solve any problem? Or were there problems beyond the reach of any machine, no matter how many switches you gave it?
That question had already been answered 1 year before Shannon wrote his thesis by a young mathematician working at Cambridge who had never built anything in his life. His name was Alan Turing, and the answer he found would define computation itself. The year is 1936. Alan Turing is 24 years old. He's quiet, a bit awkward socially, intense in ways that sometimes make people uncomfortable. He has a habit of running long distances alone, sometimes covering marathon distances along country roads to clear his head and work through problems. He stammers slightly. He chains his tea mug to a radiator so nobody will take it. He's recently graduated from King's College, Cambridge, and he's working on abstract problems in mathematical logic that seem to have absolutely nothing to do with building machines or breaking codes or any practical endeavor whatsoever. Nobody outside a small circle of mathematicians has any reason to know his name. He's trying to answer a question posed decades earlier by the German mathematician David Hilbert. In 1900, Hilbert had outlined 23 problems he believed would shape mathematics in the coming century, and one of them had led to what became known as the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. The question was this: is there a mechanical procedure, an algorithm, that can determine whether any given mathematical statement is provable? This sounds technical and remote, the kind of question only mathematicians care about. But beneath the formalism, it touches something fundamental. Is there a foolproof method for finding truth? Can reasoning itself be completely mechanized? Can thinking be reduced entirely to following rules? To answer this, Turing needed to do something nobody had done before. He needed to define precisely what a mechanical procedure actually was. What could a machine do? What were the fundamental limits of computation? And to do that, he imagined the simplest possible computing device. Picture an infinitely long tape divided into squares. Each square is either blank or marked with a symbol, say a 1 or a 0, though any symbols would work. A reading head sits over one square at a time. It can read the symbol on that square. Based on what it reads and its own internal state, it can write a new symbol, move one square to the left or right, and change its internal state. That's the entire machine. No memory except what's written on the tape. No complexity, no sophistication. Just read, write, move, change state, repeat. This became known as a Turing machine, and it's not a real machine. You couldn't build one because the tape is infinite. It's a thought experiment, a mathematical abstraction. But it captured something essential about what it means to compute. Turing showed that this absurdly simple machine could perform any calculation that could be described as a precise, step-by-step procedure. Addition, multiplication, finding square roots, solving equations. Anything you could break down into basic operations, a Turing machine could do. But then he proved something more profound. He showed that you could design a universal Turing machine, a single machine that could simulate any other Turing machine. You'd feed the universal machine a description of another machine and its input, and the universal machine would produce the same output. One machine could be any machine, depending on what you told it to do. Think about that for a moment. Your laptop is a universal Turing machine, so is your phone. They're not specialized for any particular task, they're general purpose. They can run any program because programs are just descriptions of what to do, and the machine follows those descriptions mechanically. The software doesn't change the hardware. The physical machine remains the same whether you're writing a document, playing a video, or browsing the web. What changes is the pattern of instructions loaded into memory. The universality Turing proved in 1936 explains why a single device in your pocket can be a camera,
a map, a library, a communication device, a game console, and 1,000 other things. Turing had mathematically proven that this kind of universality was possible, decades before anyone built a machine that demonstrated it. But Turing also proved something darker, something that set a permanent boundary around what any computer can ever do. He asked whether there could be an algorithm that determines, for any given Turing machine and any given input, whether that machine will eventually halt, finish its calculation, and produce an answer, or whether it will run forever, caught in an infinite loop. This is called the halting problem, and it seems like the kind of thing a sufficiently clever algorithm ought to be able to figure out. After all, we can often look at a program and tell whether it will finish. Surely, with enough sophistication, we could develop a general method. Turing proved it was impossible. And the proof is elegant and devastating. Assume, he said, that such an algorithm exists. Call it H. You feed H a description of any program and its input, and H tells you, this program will halt, or this program will run forever. Now construct a perverse program, call it P, that does the following. P runs H on itself. If H says P will halt, then P deliberately goes into an infinite loop and runs forever. If H says P will run forever, then P immediately halts. What happens when you run P? If H predicts P halts, then P doesn't halt. If H predicts P runs forever, then P halts. Either way, H is wrong. The assumption that H exists leads to a contradiction. Therefore, no such algorithm can exist. This is not a failure of human cleverness. It's not that we haven't been smart enough to find the right algorithm yet, and maybe, someday, we will. Turing proved that the algorithm cannot exist. Period. There are problems that no procedure, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how much time or memory it's given, can solve. Some questions are undecidable. Permanently, absolutely, for any machine that could ever be built, in this universe or any other that follows the same rules of logic. And Turing wasn't the only one reaching this kind of result. Just a few years earlier, in 1931, a young Austrian logician named Kurt Gödel had proven something equally unsettling about mathematics itself. Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that any formal mathematical system powerful enough to describe basic arithmetic must contain true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Mathematics could not be made complete and consistent and formal all at the same time. There would always be truths that escaped the net of proof. Gödel and Turing, working on slightly different problems, had both found walls, permanent limits on what formal systems and mechanical procedures could achieve. Not practical limits that might be overcome with better technology, but logical limits built into the structure of mathematics and computation themselves. And this connects directly to the question we asked at the beginning of tonight's story. Is there a boundary to what these machines can do? Yes, Turing found it. There are questions that no machine, however powerful, can answer. The boundary is real, it's permanent, and it was discovered by pure logic, not by running into it experimentally. And here's what's remarkable about these limits. They were discovered before anyone had built a working computer. Turing found the boundary of what machines could do before machines existed to test it against. He mapped the shoreline of an ocean nobody had yet sailed. Turing had answered Hilbert's question with a no. There is no universal procedure for determining mathematical truth. And in answering it, he had accidentally defined what computation is, established its boundaries, and proven that universal machines were possible. He had created the theoretical foundation of computer science, working alone, with nothing but pencil and paper, 3 years before the outbreak of the war that would make his ideas urgently practical. Turing also made his way to Princeton, where he spent 2 years studying under Alonzo Church,
the American mathematician who had independently arrived at similar results about the limits of computation through a completely different mathematical approach called the lambda calculus. Church and Turing showed that their systems were equivalent. Anything computable in one was computable in the other. This convergence, two very different approaches leading to the same answer, strengthened the conviction that they had captured something fundamental about the nature of computation.
The Church-Turing thesis, as it came to be called, holds that these formal models capture everything that can be computed by any physical device following a rule-based procedure. It's a thesis, not a theorem. It can't be formally proven because there's no formal definition of any physical device. But it has held up for almost 90 years against every challenge, and he left behind his own question for the conversation. The question that would haunt the rest of his short life, and that haunts us still. If a machine can compute anything that is computable, if it can simulate any other machine, if it is, in some mathematical sense, universal, can it think? Turing would come back to this question 14 years later, in a famous paper that opened with exactly those words.
And the life that carried him from that 1936 paper to that 1950 paper was itself extraordinary, marked by secret wartime heroism, groundbreaking intellectual contributions, and ultimately, terrible personal tragedy. But we'll get to that. First, the world was about to go to war, and abstract mathematics was about to become a matter of survival. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. And almost immediately, the question of computation stopped being theoretical and became a matter of life and death. The German military used a device called the Enigma machine to encrypt their communications. Enigma was an electromechanical cipher machine about the size of a typewriter, with a keyboard, a set of rotating wheels called rotors, and a plug board that swapped pairs of letters. When you pressed a key, electrical current flowed through the rotors and the plug board, scrambling the letter through multiple substitutions. The rotors turned with each keystroke, so the same letter pressed twice would produce different encrypted outputs each time. The number of possible settings was astronomical. Each rotor could be set to one of 26 positions. The machines had 3 or more rotors, and the plug board added additional complexity. The total number of possible configurations ran into the billions. Each day, German operators would set their Enigma machines to new configurations according to distributed key sheets. Messages encrypted with one day's settings couldn't be read with another day's settings. Even if you captured an Enigma machine, without knowing the daily settings, you couldn't decipher anything. Breaking Enigma meant testing vast numbers of possible settings, far more than any team of human analysts could check manually, even working around the clock. The British at their code-breaking centre at Bletchley Park, a sprawling Victorian estate in the English countryside, gathered some of the best mathematical minds in the country, and Alan Turing was among them. Turing designed a machine called the bomb to automate the search for Enigma settings. The bomb was a specialized electromechanical device, not a general-purpose computer. It couldn't be reprogrammed to solve different problems, but it could do one thing with extraordinary speed: test potential Enigma settings by looking for contradictions. The key to the bomb was exploiting weaknesses in how the Germans used Enigma. Certain messages had predictable content. Weather reports often began with the German word for weather. Military communications followed standard formats. These known or guessed phrases, called cribs, provided a foothold.
If you suspected that a particular stretch of encrypted text corresponded to a known phrase, you could use that assumption to constrain the possible settings. The bomb would then test the remaining possibilities mechanically, using electrical circuits to simulate the Enigma's operation and flag settings that produced consistent results. When the bomb found a potential match, it stopped, and human operators would verify whether the setting was correct. If the decrypted text was gibberish, they'd restart the machine
and let it continue searching. If the text was coherent German, they'd found that day's setting, and every message intercepted that day could be decrypted. This interplay between machine speed and human judgment was crucial, and it anticipated a dynamic that would define computing for the next 80 years. The machine handled the overwhelming tedium of checking millions of possibilities, grinding through combinations far faster than any team of humans could. The humans provided insight, intuition, and the ability to recognize when a decrypted message made sense. They chose the cribs. They interpreted the results. They decided what to do with the intelligence. Machine and human, each contributing what the other couldn't. At its peak, Bletchley Park employed about 10,000 people, many of them women, working in shifts around the clock. Most of them had no idea what the overall operation was doing. The work was compartmentalized for security. You might spend your entire shift operating one part of one machine, processing one kind of message, without knowing how your work fit into the larger picture. The secrecy was absolute. Workers were told they could never speak about what they did, not to family, not to friends, not to anyone, ever. Many of them kept that silence for 30 years, until the operation was declassified in the 1970s. The work at Bletchley Park remained classified for decades after the war. The full story didn't become public until the 1970s, but historians now estimate that the intelligence gained from breaking Enigma shortened the war by at least 2 years and saved millions of lives. Turing's contribution was pivotal, and Bletchley Park produced another machine that deserves mention, one that was even more advanced than the bomb. By 1943, the Germans were using a more sophisticated encryption system called Lorenz for their highest-level communications, messages between Hitler and his generals. The Lorenz cipher was far more complex than Enigma, and breaking it required a different approach. A team at Bletchley Park, led by the engineer Tommy Flowers, built a machine called Colossus to attack the Lorenz cipher. Colossus used vacuum tubes as electronic switches, about 1,500 of them in its first version, and it could process data at electronic speeds, reading punched tape at 5,000 characters per second. Colossus was arguably the first electronic digital computer, though it was special purpose rather than general purpose, and its existence remained classified until the 1970s. The machines were dismantled after the war on Churchill's orders, and the blueprints were destroyed. The knowledge of what had been achieved simply vanished, at least from the public record, and computing history books written before the 1970s don't mention it at all. Meanwhile, in Berlin, in his parents' living room, a German engineer named Konrad Zuse was building something remarkable with almost no resources. Working largely alone, Zuse had built the Z1 in the late 1930s, a mechanical binary calculator programmed using punched film strips. It was unreliable, but Zuse understood something important. Binary was the right number system for machines because distinguishing between exactly 2 states, on and off, was far easier and more reliable for physical components than distinguishing between 10 states as the decimal system would require. Zuse's Z3, completed in 1941, was the first fully functional programmable computer. It used electromechanical relays as switches, processed binary numbers, read instructions from punched tape, and performed floating-point arithmetic. It was destroyed in a bombing raid on Berlin in 1943, and Zuse's work remained largely unknown outside Germany for years. He and Turing never communicated. Zuse had never read Turing's 1936 paper. They had arrived at similar ideas independently from completely different starting points on opposite sides of a war. The conversation doesn't always flow in a straight line. Sometimes the same question gets answered in parallel by people who don't know the other exists. And this is another piece of the answer to our opening question about inevitability.
When the same idea arises independently in multiple places at once, that suggests something deeper at work, a kind of pressure building in the conversation itself, a question that has become so ripe that multiple people reach for the answer simultaneously. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different kind of machine was being built for a different purpose. The United States Army needed to calculate artillery firing tables. These tables told gunners how to aim their weapons, mapping out how far a shell would travel given different launch angles, different muzzle velocities, and different atmospheric conditions. Calculating one table required hundreds of separate differential equations. A human computer, working with a mechanical calculator, could calculate one trajectory per day. There were thousands of trajectories needed per table.
The Army funded a project at the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Engineering to build an electronic calculator that could do this work faster. The project was led by John Mauchly, a physicist, and J. Presper Eckert, an engineer. And the result, completed in 1945, was ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. ENIAC was a monster. It weighed about 30 tons. It occupied about 1,800 square feet of floor space, roughly the size of a large apartment. It contained 17,468 vacuum tubes, glass bulbs that functioned as electronic switches, the same technology used in radios and early televisions. When it was turned on, it consumed so much electricity that it reportedly dimmed the lights in the surrounding neighborhood. It generated so much heat that it required industrial cooling fans. And it was fragile. Vacuum tubes burned out constantly.
On average, one failed every couple of days, and finding the dead tube among 17,000 required painstaking troubleshooting. But when ENIAC worked, it was miraculous. It could perform 5,000 additions per second. Calculations that took humans days could be done in minutes. Artillery tables that required weeks of hand computation could be generated overnight. ENIAC was completed too late to affect the war's outcome, but it proved something that changed the world. Machines could perform intellectual work, real calculations that mattered, faster than any team of humans. And there's a part of this story that was hidden for decades, a part that connects directly to the theme of invisible contributors. ENIAC had to be programmed. And programming it meant physically rewiring the machine, reconnecting cables and resetting switches to configure it for each new problem.
The people who did this work, who figured out how to translate mathematical problems into the machine's physical configuration, who debugged the connections and verified the results, were 6 women: Kathleen McNulty, Jean Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlin Meltzer, Ruth Teitelbaum, and Frances Billas. They were mathematicians who had been working as human computers, calculating ballistics trajectories by hand. They were given the job of programming ENIAC without any manuals because no manuals existed. They had to learn the machine's architecture from its logical diagrams and figure out the programming themselves. These 6 women had to understand ENIAC's architecture better than almost anyone, because programming it wasn't a matter of writing code in the way we think of it today. It was a physical activity. They had to trace the flow of numbers through the machine's circuits, figure out which cables needed to connect to which panels, which switches needed to be set in which positions, and test every configuration manually before running a problem. When something went wrong, they had to diagnose whether the error was in their wiring or in a hardware malfunction. A dead vacuum tube among 17,000. They developed debugging techniques, testing strategies, and logical approaches to programming that would influence the field for decades. Betty Snyder, later Betty Holberton, went on to help develop the UNIVAC computer and wrote the first sorting program, a program that sorted data that was later widely imitated.
She also proposed the idea that computer programs should be written in something closer to mathematical notation rather than raw machine code, an idea that contributed to the development of programming languages. Jean Jennings Bartik became a senior programmer on UNIVAC and later worked in technical publishing. But for decades, when photographs of ENIAC appeared in textbooks and articles, the women in the photos were identified, if they were identified at all, as models or as refrigerator ladies, a term that reflected the assumption that the women standing beside the massive machine were there for decoration, the way women appeared beside refrigerators in appliance advertisements. Their names went unrecorded, their technical contributions were invisible. It wasn't until a researcher named Kathy Kleiman began investigating in the 1980s and 90s, tracking down the surviving programmers and recording their stories, that the full picture began to emerge. The 6 ENIAC programmers were inducted into the Women in Technology International Hall of Fame in 1997, more than 50 years after their work. ENIAC answered a question that the conversation had been building toward for over a century. Can an electronic machine perform complex calculations at speeds far beyond human ability? The answer was yes. But ENIAC also had a significant limitation that pointed toward the next question. Every time you wanted to change what ENIAC calculated, you had to physically rewire it. The program was the machine's physical configuration. Changing tasks could take days. A machine that has to be rebuilt every time you want it to do something different is powerful but inflexible. And someone who had read Turing's 1936 paper about universal machines realized that there was a better way. That person was John von Neumann, and his insight would become the architecture of every computer built from that point forward. John von Neumann was one of those figures who seemed to belong to a different category of human intellect entirely.
Born in Budapest in 1903 into a wealthy Jewish family, he was a prodigy of almost frightening ability. He could divide 8-digit numbers in his head by age 6. He mastered calculus by 8. He could memorize entire pages of a telephone directory at a glance and recite them back years later. As an adult, he would sometimes entertain colleagues at dinner parties by being given the first line of any page of a book he had read and reciting the rest of the page from memory. He went on to make foundational contributions to mathematics, physics, economics, game theory, and computing. He helped design the implosion mechanism for the atomic bomb at Los Alamos. He invented game theory, the mathematical study of strategic decision-making, which influenced economics, political science, and military strategy. His colleagues at Princeton, where he worked at the Institute for Advanced Study alongside Albert Einstein, were sometimes unnerved by the speed of his mind.
Edward Teller, the physicist, said that von Neumann's mind was a perfect instrument whose gears were machined to mesh accurately to 1/1000th of an inch. He processed ideas so quickly that conversations with him could feel like trying to keep up with someone running downhill. Von Neumann had read Turing's 1936 paper on computable numbers. He understood the concept of a universal machine, a computer that could become any machine simply by reading different instructions from memory. And when he encountered ENIAC, he immediately saw both its power and its fundamental flaw. ENIAC's instructions were embedded in its physical wiring. To change the program, you had to change the machine. But Turing had shown, mathematically, that instructions and data were the same kind of thing. Both were just symbols, patterns. There was no reason they had to be stored differently. In 1945, von Neumann wrote a document, sometimes called the first draft of a report on the EDVAC, that described a new computer architecture. The key idea was breathtakingly simple. Store the program in the same memory as the data. Don't hardwire instructions into the machine's physical configuration. Treat instructions as just another form of data.
numbers that tell the machine what to do. The machine reads an instruction from memory, executes it, and moves to the next instruction. To change what the computer does, you don't rewire anything. You just load different instructions into memory. This is the stored program concept, and it changed everything. Programs are data, instructions are numbers. Memory holds both. The computer doesn't know or care whether a particular memory location contains an instruction telling it what to do or a number it's processing. Everything is just patterns of electrical charge in memory. Think about the implications. A program can modify itself because it can write to the same memory that holds its own instructions. One program can create another program because generating a program is just generating a sequence of numbers and storing them in memory. A computer can simulate a completely different computer by loading a program that mimics the behavior of the other machine's hardware. This is how video game emulators work. A modern computer running software that faithfully recreates the behavior of a decades-old game console. The stored program architecture made software infinitely flexible. The same physical machine could be a word processor, a video player, a web browser, a game console, anything, just by loading different patterns into memory. Turing had proven this was theoretically possible in 1936. Von Neumann showed how to build it in practice.
And the first machines to implement this architecture were built in the late 1940s in both Britain and the United States. The small-scale experimental machine at Manchester, nicknamed Baby, ran its first program on June 21, 1948. It stored both data and instructions in the same memory, using cathode ray tubes, and it could search for the highest factor of a number by running through possibilities and updating its own memory with results. It took 52 minutes to run, but it ran all by itself, reading its own instructions, making its own decisions, looping back and repeating operations until it found the answer. Something fundamental had shifted. The computer was no longer a calculator that humans aimed at a specific problem. It was a general-purpose machine. It could, in principle, compute anything computable. You could load a program that calculated artillery trajectories today and load a different program that analyzed census data tomorrow.
The hardware didn't change, only the instructions in memory changed. The machine had become, as Turing had predicted on paper 12 years earlier, a universal machine. And now, Turing's theoretical framework and von Neumann's practical architecture had merged. The two streams of the conversation, the mathematical proof that universal machines were possible and the engineering reality of building them, had come together. They would never separate again. But there was a problem, and it was physical, not theoretical. The machines of the late 1940s and early 1950s ran on vacuum tubes. And vacuum tubes were, to put it plainly, terrible. They were large, about the size of a light bulb. They were fragile, made of glass. They consumed enormous amounts of power and generated punishing heat. And they burned out constantly. ENIAC's 17,000 tubes failed at a rate of about 1 every 2 days. Most of the time the machine was down, someone was crawling through it with a flashlight, looking for the dead tube. To build more powerful computers, you needed more switches. To have more switches, you needed more vacuum tubes. And more vacuum tubes meant more heat, more power consumption, more failures, more downtime. The technology was hitting a wall. You could make computers bigger, but you couldn't make them much more reliable. And a machine that spends most of its time broken is not very useful, no matter how fast it is when it works. The conversation needed a new answer to a new question. How do you make a switch that doesn't burn out? The answer came from a laboratory in New Jersey, and it arrived in late 1947. Bell Telephone Laboratories, the research arm of AT&T, was one of the great industrial research institutions of the 20th century. Its researchers had already contributed to radio astronomy information theory, and the development of radar.
And in the years immediately after the war, a team at Bell Labs was working on a very specific problem: finding a solid-state alternative to the vacuum tube. The team was led by William Shockley, a brilliant but difficult physicist whose ambition and abrasiveness would later drive many of his colleagues away. The key experimental work was done by John Bardeen, a quiet, thoughtful theorist, and Walter Brattain, a skilled experimentalist with a gift for making things work in the lab. On December 16, 1947, Bardeen and Brattain demonstrated a device that amplified an electrical signal using a small piece of germanium, a semiconductor material. It was the first working transistor. A transistor does the same job as a vacuum tube. It switches and amplifies electrical signals, but it does it with a tiny piece of semiconductor material instead of a glass bulb with a heated filament. No vacuum required, no hot filament to burn out. The transistor was smaller, faster, more reliable, and used vastly less power than a vacuum tube. All three men, Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain, would share the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. To understand why the transistor matters so much, think about what it actually does at the most basic level. A transistor has three terminals. Two of them are the main conducting path, like the two ends of a wire. The third terminal is the control input. When you apply a small voltage to the control terminal, it changes the electrical properties of the semiconductor material between the other two terminals, either allowing current to flow or blocking it. An electrically controlled switch. And because it's a switch with two states, conducting or not conducting, it maps perfectly onto binary logic. Voltage present means 1. No voltage means 0.
Wire up enough transistors according to Shannon's rules. The rules connecting Boolean algebra to electrical circuits. And you can perform logical operations. Wire up logical operations in the right combinations, and you can do arithmetic. Wire up arithmetic, and you can compute. Early transistors were discrete components, individually manufactured and wired together by hand. But in 1958, two engineers, working independently and unaware of each other's efforts, developed something that would accelerate the conversation beyond anything anyone had imagined. Jack Kilby, at Texas Instruments in Dallas, demonstrated that multiple electronic components, transistors, resistors, and capacitors, could be fabricated together on a single piece of semiconductor material. And Robert Noyce, at Fairchild Semiconductor in California, developed a more practical manufacturing process for achieving the same thing, using a planar process that could be scaled up to mass production. This was the integrated circuit, the microchip. And it meant that instead of wiring individual transistors together by hand, you could fabricate dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of them on a single chip of silicon, all at once, using photographic and chemical processes. In 1965, Gordon Moore, who had co-founded Fairchild Semiconductor with Noyce and would later co-found Intel, noticed a pattern. The number of transistors that could be placed on a single chip was doubling approximately every 2 years. He predicted this trend would continue. His prediction, which became known as Moore's Law, held for over 50 years. And the consequences of exponential doubling are genuinely difficult for the human mind to grasp, because our intuitions are built for linear growth. If something doubles once, it's twice as big. That feels manageable. But doubling doesn't stop. It compounds.
Start with 2,300 transistors on Intel's first microprocessor, the 4004, in 1971. Double every 2 years. By 1975, you have about 10,000. By 1980, tens of thousands. By 1990, more than 1 million.
By 2000, tens of millions. By 2010, billions. By the early 2020s, modern processors contain something like 50 billion transistors on a chip you could rest on your fingertip. To put this in perspective, imagine you had a magic penny that doubled every day. On day 1, you have 1 cent. On day 10, about $5. Unimpressive. On day 20, about $5,000. Interesting. On day 30, over $5 million. That's the power of exponential growth. It creeps along slowly at first, barely noticeable, and then it explodes. The semiconductor industry sustained this doubling for over 50 years, and every time transistors got smaller, 3 things happened in parallel. Computers got faster, because smaller transistors switch more quickly. They got cheaper, because you could fit more transistors on the same area of silicon. And they used less power per transistor, because smaller switches require less energy to flip. This triple benefit, faster, cheaper, and more efficient, all advancing simultaneously, is what drove the entire digital revolution. It's why a smartphone that costs a few $100s today has more computing power than a room-sized military computer from the 1960s. Each one of those transistors is a switch. Each one is turning on and off, billions of times per second. And every single one is doing the simplest possible thing: conducting current or not conducting current, 1 or 0, true or false, on or off.
The same binary logic that George Boole described with pencil and paper in 1854, that Claude Shannon connected to electrical circuits in 1937, now etched into silicon at a scale so small that individual features are measured in nanometers, billionths of a meter, smaller than the wavelength of visible light. We took sand, silicon dioxide, one of the most abundant materials on Earth, purified it to extraordinary levels, doped it with carefully controlled impurities, carved patterns into it with ultraviolet light, and created thinking machines. We taught rocks to compute. And the answer to the question, can we make a switch from solid rock, turned out to be the most consequential yes in the history of technology. But billions of transistors are useless if you don't know how to organize them. Having all the switches in the world doesn't help if you can't tell them what to do in a language more practical than raw binary.
The hardware was advancing at breathtaking speed. Now the conversation needed to address a different problem entirely. How do you talk to these machines? The earliest computers were programmed in machine code, raw sequences of ones and zeros that the processor could execute directly. Each instruction was a specific binary number. Load this value from this memory address. Add it to this other value. Store the result here. Jump to this address if the result is 0. Every operation, no matter how trivial, had to be spelled out in binary. Programming in machine code was brutally tedious. A simple calculation might require dozens of instructions. A typo in a single digit, a 0 where a 1 should be, could crash the entire program or worse, produce silently wrong results. Writing machine code required intimate knowledge of the specific hardware you were programming.
An instruction that worked on one machine wouldn't work on another because different processors had different instruction sets. The first step away from this was assembly language, which replaced binary codes with short, human-readable abbreviations. Instead of writing a string of ones and zeros, you'd write something like add, or load, or jump. An assembler, a simple program, would translate these abbreviations back into binary. This was better, but only incrementally. You were still thinking at the level of individual machine operations, and the code was still tied to a specific processor. The real breakthrough came from a woman named Grace Hopper, and it came from a conviction that most of her colleagues thought was absurd. Hopper believed that computers could be programmed in something resembling English. Grace Murray Hopper was born in New York City in 1906. She earned her PhD in mathematics from Yale in 1934, one of very few women to do so at that time. During the war, she joined the Navy Reserve and was assigned to work on the Harvard Mark I, one of the earliest electromechanical computers. After the war, she moved to the private sector and worked on UNIVAC, one of the first commercial computers. Hopper is often associated with the term bug in computing. The story goes that in 1947, a moth was found trapped in a relay of the Harvard Mark II computer, causing a malfunction. Hopper's team taped it into the logbook and wrote, "First actual case of bug being found." The actual coinage of bug for a technical problem predates this incident, but the story has become legend. But Hopper's truly revolutionary contribution was the compiler. She wanted to write programs in something closer to English, using words and mathematical notation instead of binary codes. Her colleagues told her this was impossible. Computers, they said, could only do arithmetic. They couldn't understand words. Hopper ignored them. In the early 1950s, she developed one of the first compilers, a program that translates instructions written in a higher-level language into the machine code that the computer actually executes. The idea was simple but transformative. You write your program in a language that humans can read. The compiler translates it automatically into the binary instructions the machine needs. The programmer never has to think about the specific hardware. The compiler handles the translation. Hopper went on to help develop COBOL, the Common Business-Oriented Language, in 1959. COBOL was designed so that business programs could be read almost like English prose. A line of COBOL might say, "Multiply hours worked by pay rate, giving gross pay." Compared to machine code, this was practically poetry. Around the same time, a team at IBM, led by John Backus, was developing Fortran, short for formula translation, which allowed scientists and engineers to write mathematical formulas in a notation that closely resembled algebra. Before Fortran, programming a mathematical computation meant writing out each step in machine-level detail. After Fortran, a single line like y equals a times x squared plus b times x plus c would automatically be translated into dozens of machine instructions by the compiler. The programmer could think about the mathematics instead of the machinery. And there was another woman whose contribution to the conversation deserves its own moment. In the late 1960s, NASA was preparing to send astronauts to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's onboard computer, the Apollo Guidance Computer, was a marvel of miniaturization for its era, built with integrated circuits at a time when most computers still used individual transistors.
But the software that ran on it was in some ways even more impressive than the hardware. Margaret Hamilton led the team at MIT's instrumentation laboratory that developed the flight software for Apollo. She was in her early 30s, often working nights and weekends, sometimes bringing her young daughter to the lab. Hamilton and her team wrote the code that guided the spacecraft through every phase of its mission, from launch to lunar orbit to landing to return. During the Apollo 11 landing, the computer was overloaded with data from a radar system that shouldn't have been active. Hamilton's software had been designed with priority-based scheduling, a system that could recognize which tasks were essential and which could be deferred. When the overload hit, the software shed its lower priority tasks and kept running the critical guidance calculations. The landing proceeded.
Without Hamilton's architectural decisions, the computer would have crashed, and Armstrong and Aldrin might never have set foot on the moon. Hamilton coined the term software engineering to describe her discipline, and her colleagues initially laughed at her. At the time, software was not considered engineering. Hardware was engineering. Software was just the instructions you gave to the hardware, a secondary concern. Hamilton insisted that building reliable software was just as rigorous and just as important as building reliable hardware, and the Apollo missions proved her right. Today, the term she invented is the standard name for an entire field. These high-level languages answered the conversation's immediate question. Yes, we can write instructions in something closer to human language, but they also did something deeper. They added a new layer of abstraction to the growing stack. Transistors abstracted away vacuum tubes.
Integrated circuits abstracted away individual transistors. Machine code abstracted away electrical signals. Assembly language abstracted away binary numbers. And now, high-level languages abstracted away machine code. Each layer hid the complexity of the one below it. Each layer allowed the next generation of builders to focus on higher-level problems. A programmer writing Fortran didn't need to know how the processor's logic gates worked. A scientist using Fortran didn't need to know how the compiler translated formulas into machine instructions. The details of the lower layers became invisible, handled automatically, taken on trust. This principle of layered abstraction is one of the deepest ideas in all of computing. It's how you manage complexity that would otherwise be completely overwhelming. No single human being alive today understands a modern computer from the physics of individual transistors all the way up to the behavior of a web browser.
The system is too complex for any one mind. But because each layer provides a clean, reliable interface to the layer above it, people can work at whatever level of abstraction their problem requires, trusting the layers below to do their jobs correctly. And there's a human cost to this too, a pattern that keeps repeating throughout the conversation. Every time a new layer of abstraction appears, the people who mastered the previous layer feel threatened. Assembly language programmers look down on Fortran programmers. Fortran programmers would later look down on programmers using even higher level languages. The people who understand the lower levels always suspect that the people working at higher levels don't really understand what they're doing. And in a sense, that's true. They don't understand the lower levels, that's the point. Abstraction means not needing to understand the lower levels in order to build something useful on top of them.
And with higher-level languages came the need for another layer entirely, the operating system. As computers became more powerful, they were asked to do more things, often simultaneously. Multiple users wanted to share a single machine. Multiple programs needed to run at the same time. Memory had to be allocated, files had to be organized, input and output devices had to be managed. Someone, or something, needed to coordinate all of this. Early operating systems were large, complex, and often unreliable. IBM's OS/360, released in 1964 for their System/360 mainframe family, was one of the first attempts to build a general-purpose operating system, and it was famously difficult. The project ran behind schedule and over budget, prompting Fred Brooks, who managed the effort, to write a book called The Mythical Man Month, about the challenges of large software projects. His central insight, that adding more programmers to a late project makes it later, became one of the most quoted observations in software engineering. A very different approach emerged at Bell Labs in the late 1960s. Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, working in the aftermath of a failed project called Multics, began building a small, elegant operating system they called Unix. Where OS/360 tried to do everything in one monolithic system, Unix was built from small, simple tools that each did one thing well. You could combine these tools by piping the output of one into the input of another, creating complex operations from simple building blocks. The philosophy was minimalist. Do one thing and do it well. Write programs that work together. Handle text, because text is a universal interface. Ritchie also created the C programming language, which struck a balance between being close enough to the hardware for efficient execution and high-level enough for productive programming.
Unix was written in C, which meant it could be ported to different hardware relatively easily. This made Unix extraordinarily influential. Linux, the open-source operating system created by Linus Torvalds in 1991, was inspired by Unix. Mac OS, the operating system on Apple computers, is built on a Unix foundation. Android, the most widely used mobile operating system in the world, runs on a Linux kernel. iOS, the system on iPhones, is also Unix-derived. The quiet operating system decisions made by Thompson and Ritchie at Bell Labs in the early 1970s echo through virtually every computing device on the planet today. By the early 1960s, computers were powerful, increasingly reliable, and programmable in languages that trained scientists and engineers could learn. But they were still enormous, expensive, and rare. They lived in air-conditioned rooms, tended by specialists, owned by governments, universities, and large corporations.
The idea that ordinary people might someday own one, carry one in their pockets, seemed absurd. A computer was a mainframe, a room-filling machine that cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. The conversation was about to take another dramatic turn. And it would be driven not by mathematicians or military needs, but by a countercultural vision of personal empowerment, a dream that computers could be tools for individuals, not just institutions. The question that would drive the next chapter was simple, and for most people working in computing at the time, it was also ridiculous. Can everyone have one? For most of the 1950s and 60s, computing was institutional. You went to the computer. The computer did not come to you. Universities and corporations had time-sharing systems where many users accessed a single large machine through terminals. But the machine itself was centralized. It belonged to the organization. Individual access was rationed.
The idea that computers might become personal tools, owned and operated by individuals, emerged from an unlikely convergence of technological progress and cultural rebellion. The counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, with its emphasis on individual empowerment and distrust of centralized authority, found an unexpected ally in the microprocessor. In 1971, Intel released the 4004, the first commercially available microprocessor. It packed 2,300 transistors onto a single chip and could perform about 60,000 operations per second. It was designed for a Japanese calculator, not for a personal computer. But it demonstrated that you could put an entire processor, the computational heart of a computer, on a single chip, small enough to hold between your fingers. By the mid-1970s, more powerful microprocessors had appeared, and a small but passionate community of hobbyists, many of them in the San Francisco Bay Area, began building their own computers from kits. In January 1975, a small company in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called MITS, run by a former Air Force officer named Ed Roberts, began selling the Altair 8800 through the mail. It cost $397 as a kit, which you had to assemble yourself. It had no keyboard, no screen, no permanent storage. You programmed it by flipping switches on the front panel and read the output by interpreting patterns of blinking lights. By modern standards, it was laughably primitive. By the standards of 1975, it was revolutionary. For the first time, an individual could own a computer. Two young men in their early 20s saw the Altair and immediately grasped its potential.
Paul Allen and Bill Gates wrote a version of the BASIC programming language for the Altair. BASIC was a higher-level language designed to be easy to learn, and their version allowed Altair owners to write simple programs without dealing with machine code. Allen and Gates formed a company called Microsoft. The year was 1975. And here's another moment that speaks to our question about inevitability versus fragility. The following year, in a garage in Los Altos, California, two friends named Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs started a company called Apple Computer. If Wozniak, a brilliant engineer, hadn't happened to be friends with Jobs, who had a gift for marketing and a fanatical attention to the user experience, the personal computer revolution might have stayed in the world of hobbyists for years longer. Wozniak wanted to give his designs away for free. Jobs wanted to sell them. The technology was ready, but it took a specific human combination, an engineer who could build it and a salesman who could see its future, to push it into the mainstream. The Apple II, released in 1977, was one of the first commercially successful personal computers. It came fully assembled, with a keyboard, color graphics, and the ability to run software from floppy disks. A program called VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet application, launched on the Apple II in 1979 and gave businesses a compelling reason to buy personal computers. Before VisiCalc, if you wanted to model a business scenario, say projecting revenue under different growth assumptions, you'd fill out a paper spreadsheet by hand. And if you changed one number, you'd have to recalculate everything else by hand too. VisiCalc automated this. Change one number, and every dependent calculation updates instantly.
For accountants, financial analysts, and small business owners, this was transformative. VisiCalc alone is credited with selling hundreds of thousands of Apple IIs, at a time when most people still had no idea what they'd do with a computer. The personal computer had found its killer application, and the killer application was not a game or a novelty. It was a tool for thinking about numbers. Al-Khwarizmi would have recognized the impulse immediately. In 1981, IBM entered the personal computer market with the IBM PC. IBM's decision to use an open architecture, publishing the technical specifications so that other manufacturers could build compatible machines, created an enormous ecosystem of IBM-compatible clones. Companies like Compaq, Dell, and countless others began building PCs that could run the same software as IBM's machine. The operating system for the IBM PC was MS-DOS, supplied by Microsoft. And this is where the trajectory of power in the computing industry shifted decisively. IBM had given away the architecture. Microsoft kept the operating system. Within a decade, Microsoft's software, not IBM's hardware, would define the PC industry. Apple, meanwhile, took the opposite approach. Apple controlled both the hardware and the software, keeping the ecosystem tightly integrated. The Macintosh, released in 1984, introduced the graphical user interface, the GUI, to a mass audience. Instead of typing commands, you moved a mouse pointer across a screen and clicked on icons. Folders looked like folders. Files could be dragged and dropped. The computer became intuitive in a way that command line interfaces never were. The GUI wasn't Apple's invention, and this part of the story is worth lingering on because it illustrates how ideas travel through the conversation in unexpected ways. The core concepts came from Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, where researchers in the early 1970s had developed a system called the Alto. The Alto had a high-resolution bit-mapped display, windows that could overlap, icons representing files and applications, and a mouse for pointing and clicking. It also had Ethernet networking, which allowed Altos to communicate with each other and share a laser printer. PARC had, by the mid-70s, essentially invented the modern desktop computing paradigm, a decade before anyone else. But Xerox was a copier company. Its executives didn't fully grasp what their researchers had created. The Alto was never commercialized as a mass-market product. When Steve Jobs visited PARC in 1979, as part of a deal that gave Xerox the opportunity to invest in Apple, he was electrified by what he saw. Jobs later said that within 10 minutes of seeing the graphical interface, he knew that all computers would work this way someday. Apple refined, polished, and commercialized the concept, first in the Lisa, and then, more successfully, in the Macintosh. And there was an even earlier visionary behind the ideas that PARC developed. In 1968,
a researcher named Douglas Engelbart gave a presentation at a computing conference in San Francisco that became known as the mother of all demos. In 90 minutes, Engelbart demonstrated a networked computer system with a mouse, a graphical display, hypertext links, video conferencing, collaborative document editing, and a windowed interface. This was 1968. Most computers still used punched cards. Engelbart was showing the future, but the future wouldn't arrive commercially for another 15 to 20 years.
Many of the researchers who built the Alto at Park had attended Engelbart's demonstration or worked in his lab. The ideas cascaded from Engelbart to Park to Apple to Microsoft, each time being refined and made more accessible, each time reaching a wider audience. This pattern, open versus closed, IBM-compatible clones versus Apple's integrated approach, would repeat throughout the history of computing. The open approach tends to capture the larger market share. The closed approach tends to capture a disproportionate share of the profits and often delivers a more polished user experience. The pendulum keeps swinging. By the end of the 1980s, personal computers were common in offices and increasingly in homes. They were used for word processing, spreadsheets, games, and increasingly, communication. Modems, devices that converted digital signals to analog tones and back, allowed computers to communicate over telephone lines.
Bulletin board systems let people post messages and share files. Online services like CompuServe and later America Online offered curated content and email. But these were isolated networks, walled gardens, each one separate from the others. The question that was now burning in the background of the conversation was, what if all the computers in the world could talk to each other? The internet did not emerge from a single invention or a single moment. It grew over decades, in fits and starts, funded largely by the United States military, built by academics and engineers, and shaped by a philosophical vision that predated the technology by years. The vision came first. In 1962, a psychologist and computer scientist named J.C.R. Licklider wrote a series of memos while working at the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, within the U.S. Department of Defense.
Licklider described what he called the intergalactic computer network, a future in which computers around the world would be connected, allowing people to access data and programs from anywhere. Licklider wasn't an engineer. He was a visionary who could see where the technology was heading and articulate a destination that others could then work toward building. The practical work of building a network began in the late 1960s. Bob Taylor, a director at ARPA, had 3 different computer terminals in his office, each connected to a different mainframe at a different university. To use the machine at MIT, he used one terminal. To use the one at UC Berkeley, a different terminal. To reach the one at the Rand Corporation, a third. He thought this was absurd. Why couldn't all these machines be connected to each other through one network? Taylor got funding approved in 1966, and the project was handed to Larry Roberts, who became the architect of ARPANET. The network connected its first 4 nodes on October 29, 1969. UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. The first message sent over ARPANET was supposed to be the word login. A programmer at UCLA named Charlie Klein typed the L, then the O, then the system crashed. So the first message ever sent across the network that would become the internet was LO. Not exactly a stirring debut. They got the full login to work about an hour later, and within a few years, dozens of universities and research institutions were connected.
One of the things that made ARPANET so consequential, apart from the technology itself, was the culture around it. The network was built by academics and researchers, people who were accustomed to sharing ideas and collaborating openly. The technical standards for the network were published as Requests for Comments, or RFCs, a deliberately modest name that invited participation and feedback.
The first RFC, written by Steve Crocker in April 1969, opened with an almost apologetic tone, explaining that the notes were informal and not meant as official statements. This collaborative, open, non-hierarchical approach to building the network's protocols would become a defining characteristic of the Internet itself. A crucial technical innovation made the Internet possible: packet switching. Instead of establishing a dedicated connection between two computers for the duration of a communication, the way a telephone call works, packet switching breaks each message into small pieces called packets. Each packet is labeled with its destination address and sent independently through the network. Different packets from the same message might travel different routes. At the destination, they're reassembled in the correct order. This approach is robust. If one path through the network fails, packets can find alternative routes.
It's efficient because the network's capacity is shared among all users rather than being reserved for individual connections. And it's scalable because adding new nodes to the network doesn't require a fundamental redesign. The protocols that make the Internet work, TCP/IP, were developed in the 1970s by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, handles breaking messages into packets and reassembling them. IP, Internet Protocol, handles routing packets through the network. These protocols established a common language that any computer could speak, regardless of its manufacturer, operating system, or hardware architecture. Any machine that implemented TCP/IP could join the network. By the mid-1980s, the Internet connected thousands of computers at universities and research institutions. But it was still a tool for specialists. Accessing information required knowing specific commands and network addresses. There was no easy way to browse, no intuitive interface for finding and viewing content. That changed because of a physicist at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, in Geneva, Switzerland. Tim Berners-Lee was frustrated by a very specific problem. Researchers at CERN had difficulty sharing information. Documents were stored on different computers in different formats, and finding what you needed required knowing exactly where it was and how to access it. In 1989, Berners-Lee proposed a system for organizing and linking information using hypertext, text that contains links to other text. He built three things: HTML, the hypertext markup language, a simple way to format documents and create links between them; HTTP, the hypertext transfer protocol, a set of rules for transmitting documents over the Internet; and the first web browser, a program that could request documents from servers, display them, and follow links to other documents. Berners-Lee put his system online in 1991, and then he and CERN made a decision that shaped everything that followed. They made the web's protocols freely available. No patents, no licensing fees, no royalties. Anyone in the world could build a website. Anyone could build a web browser. Anyone could use HTTP and HTML without paying a cent to anyone. Berners-Lee has said many times that the web would never have taken off if it had been proprietary. Other hypertext systems existed at the time, some of them technically superior. But they were commercial products, owned by companies, subject to licensing restrictions. The web won because it was free, open, and unowned. Nobody controlled it. Nobody could shut it down. Nobody could charge you for the privilege of putting something on it. This openness was a conscious philosophical choice, and it made all the difference.
Early web browsers like Mosaic, released in 1993 by a team at the University of Illinois that included a young programmer named Mark Andreessen, made the web accessible to non-technical users. Mosaic could display images alongside text, which sounds trivial now but was revolutionary then. Andreessen went on to co-found Netscape, whose Navigator browser brought the web to millions of people. And then came search. The early web had no central directory. Finding information meant knowing the URL of the website you wanted, following links from known sites, or using primitive search engines that indexed only a fraction of the web. In 1998, two Stanford graduate students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin launched Google. They had met a few years earlier at Stanford's computer science department, and they had initially disliked each other, arguing about nearly everything during a campus tour. But they shared an obsession with organizing the web's rapidly growing chaos. Their key insight was an algorithm called PageRank, which ranked web pages not just by the words they contained, but by how many other pages linked to them and how important those linking pages were. A page linked to by many important pages was likely to be important itself. The web, in other words, was voting on itself. Every link was a recommendation, and PageRank counted those recommendations, weighted by the credibility of whoever was recommending. It was, in essence, a system for measuring trust and authority across the entire web, and it produced dramatically better search results than anything that had come before. The previous generation of search engines, services like AltaVista and Lycos and Yahoo, ranked pages primarily by keyword frequency, which meant that pages stuffed with repetitions of popular search terms could game their way to the top of the results.
PageRank was much harder to fool because it depended on what other people thought of your page, not just what you said about yourself. Google started in a garage. Within a few years, it was the dominant search engine in the world. Within a decade, it was one of the most powerful companies in human history. And the infrastructure it built, vast data centers containing millions of servers, would become the foundation for something much bigger. And then the device that would put the entire internet into billions of pockets arrived. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. Jobs described it as 3 devices in one: a widescreen iPod, a mobile phone, and an internet communications device. But what made the iPhone revolutionary wasn't any single feature. It was the integration. A touchscreen interface that eliminated the physical keyboard, a web browser that displayed real web pages, not stripped-down mobile versions.
An accelerometer that detected when you rotated the device. And most importantly, a year later, the App Store, which allowed any developer anywhere in the world to write software for the iPhone and distribute it to millions of users. The App Store turned the iPhone from a device into a platform. Within a year, there were tens of thousands of apps. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands. Your phone became a camera, a map, a compass, a flashlight, a boarding pass, a wallet, a fitness tracker, a musical instrument. Each of those functions had previously required a separate physical object. Now they were all software, all patterns loaded into the same universal machine, just as Turing's mathematics had predicted decades earlier. Google responded with Android, an open-source mobile operating system that any manufacturer could use. Samsung, HTC, LG, Motorola, and dozens of others built Android phones.
The pattern from the PC era repeated. Apple controlled both hardware and software, keeping everything tightly integrated. Google made the software open and let others build the hardware. Android captured the larger market share worldwide. Apple captured a disproportionate share of the profits. The same pattern playing out again in a different decade. and the impact of smartphones went far beyond the wealthy nations where they first appeared. Mobile phones could go places that desktop computers and broadband connections couldn't. Cell towers were cheaper to deploy than wired infrastructure. As smartphone prices dropped, especially on the Android side where manufacturers competed fiercely, billions of people who had never owned a computer of any kind suddenly had one in their hands. By the early 2020s, there were more than 6 billion smartphone users worldwide. 6 billion universal Turing machines in human hands.
The trajectory from a scratched bone in Central Africa to 6 billion interconnected computing devices is, if you step back and look at it, almost vertigo-inducing. Alongside the smartphone revolution, another shift was happening in the background. Amazon, the online retailer, had built enormous data centers to run its own operations, and in 2006, it began renting that computing power to anyone who wanted it. The service was called Amazon Web Services, and its flagship product, Elastic Compute Cloud, let you rent servers by the hour. Need 10 machines for a day to handle a traffic spike? Spin them up, use them, shut them down, pay only for what you used. This was cloud computing, and it changed the economics of starting a technology company overnight. Instagram, when it launched in 2010 and gained 1 million users in 2 months, was running on AWS. So was Netflix's streaming service. So was Airbnb.
Tiny teams could build services that reached millions because the hard problem of infrastructure had been abstracted away, another layer added to the stack. The internet had connected machines. The web had made information accessible. Search had made information findable. Smartphones had put all of it in every pocket, and the cloud had made computing power available to anyone with a credit card. But the conversation wasn't finished, because now billions of people were generating data at an unprecedented scale. Billions of web pages, billions of images, billions of messages and searches and transactions. And all that data created a new possibility that would bring the conversation full circle, back to Ada Lovelace's question from 1843. Can a machine originate something? Can it learn? The dream of artificial intelligence is almost as old as computers themselves.
Turing raised the question explicitly in 1950 in a paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence that opened with the words, "I propose to consider the question, can machines think?" After the war, Turing had worked on computer design at the National Physical Laboratory and then at the University of Manchester, helping build some of the first stored program computers. He was doing some of the most forward-looking work in the world on artificial intelligence, on morphogenesis, the mathematical basis of how leopards get their spots and sunflowers arrange their seeds, and on the foundations of computing. And in that 1950 paper, he immediately sidestepped the philosophical quagmire of defining what think means. Instead, he proposed a practical test. Put a human and a machine in separate rooms. An interrogator communicates with both via text, asking questions and reading answers. If the interrogator can't reliably tell which responses come from the human and which from the machine, then the machine has passed the test. Not because it's proven to be conscious, but because its behavior is indistinguishable from that of a conscious entity. Turing would not live to see the field his question created. In 1952, he was prosecuted for homosexuality, which was a criminal offense in Britain at the time. He was convicted, stripped of his security clearance, and given a choice between prison and chemical castration through hormone injections. He chose the injections. On June 7, 1954, he was found dead at his home from cyanide poisoning. He was 41 years old. One of the greatest minds of the 20th century, a man whose wartime work saved millions of lives, whose theoretical work laid the foundation for the entire digital age.
was destroyed by his own country because of whom he loved.
In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. In 2019, he was named the greatest person of the 20th century in a BBC poll. But these honors came decades too late for the man himself. The conversation lost one of its most important voices far too soon, and the question he had asked, "Can machines think?" would be taken up by others just 2 years after his death. The field of artificial intelligence was formally born in the summer of 1956 at a workshop at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. John McCarthy, a young mathematician at Dartmouth, organized it with Marvin Minsky, Nathaniel Rochester of IBM, and Claude Shannon, the same Shannon who had connected Boole's logic to electrical circuits 19 years earlier. McCarthy coined the term artificial intelligence for the workshop proposal, a name he chose partly because it was bold and attention-grabbing.
The proposal for the workshop is fascinating to read today because of its breathtaking confidence. It stated that the participants would proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. They expected to make significant progress in a single summer. They expected that a generation would be enough to solve the problem of machine intelligence entirely. They were wrong about the timeline by at least half a century, and possibly much more. But the ambition was genuine, and it set the agenda for a new field. The early approach, which dominated AI research from the 1950s through the 1980s, was what's now called symbolic AI, or good old-fashioned AI. The idea was to program computers with explicit rules and logical representations of knowledge. You'd encode human expertise directly into the machine. If the patient has a fever and a cough, consider pneumonia. If the traffic light is red, stop. You'd build systems that reasoned by applying rules to known facts, chaining inferences together to reach conclusions. This approach had some notable successes. Programs that could solve algebra problems, prove mathematical theorems, and play games like chess and checkers at increasing levels of skill. In 1997, IBM's Deep Blue defeated the reigning world chess champion Garry Kasparov in a 6-game match. It was a milestone that captured the world's imagination. But the rule-based approach had a fundamental limitation. The real world is messy. Consider something as simple as recognizing a cat in a photograph. How would you write rules for that? You'd need rules for pointy ears, for whiskers, for fur, for the way a cat's body moves. But what about a cat with folded ears? A hairless cat? A cat photographed from behind showing only a tail?
The number of rules would be effectively infinite, and the exceptions to the rules would have their own exceptions. Rule-based AI could handle tidy, well-defined domains like chess. It struggled with the fluid, ambiguous, context-dependent mess of the real world. AI went through cycles of hype and disappointment that researchers ruefully called AI winters. The first came in the 1970s, after initial promises of rapid progress failed to materialize. Funding agencies that had been told intelligent machines were just around the corner grew disillusioned when the machines remained stubbornly unintelligent. A report by the British mathematician James Lighthill in 1973 was particularly devastating, concluding that AI research had failed to deliver on its promises and recommending cuts in funding. Research budgets were slashed across the United States and Britain. A brief revival in the 1980s, driven by expert systems, software that encoded human specialist knowledge as rules, led to a second wave of enthusiasm and investment. Companies poured money into AI, expecting expert systems to revolutionize business decision-making. But expert systems turned out to be brittle. They worked well in narrow, well-defined domains,
but failed spectacularly when confronted with situations their rules didn't cover. The real world was messier than the rules could handle. By the late 1980s, the second AI winter had set in, and once again, the field seemed moribund. Researchers who studied neural networks or other approaches outside the mainstream sometimes avoided using the phrase artificial intelligence in their grant proposals because the term itself had become toxic. But a different approach had been quietly developing in the background, one that would eventually break through the limitations of rule-based AI.
And it started with an idea inspired by the human brain. In 1943, Warren McCulloch, a neurophysiologist, and Walter Pitts, a mathematical prodigy who was largely self-taught, published a paper describing a mathematical model of how neurons in the brain might work. Their model was simple. Each artificial neuron received inputs. Each input had a weight representing its importance. The neurons summed the weighted inputs, and if the sum exceeded a threshold, the neuron fired. If not, it remained silent. They showed that networks of these simple units, each one either firing or not firing, connected together in the right configurations, could in principle perform any logical operation. McCulloch and Pitts had connected neuroscience to computation, suggesting that the brain itself might be, at some level, a computing device.
In 1957, a psychologist named Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell built a machine called the perceptron that could learn to recognize simple patterns. It wasn't just a simulation running on a conventional computer, it was a physical device, a room-sized machine with a grid of 400 photocells connected to a network of simulated neurons. The photocells served as eyes. When you showed the perceptron an image, say a printed letter, the photocells would activate in a pattern corresponding to the shape of the letter. The network would process that pattern and produce a classification. And crucially, the network could learn. When it made a mistake, you'd adjust the strengths of the connections between neurons, strengthening the ones that contributed to correct answers and weakening the ones that led astray. After enough examples, the perceptron could learn to distinguish an A from a B or a triangle from a square. The perceptron generated enormous excitement.
The New York Times ran a story headlined, "New Navy Device Learns by Doing," and the article breathlessly reported that the machine would eventually be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. This was wildly premature, but the core idea, a machine that learns from examples rather than following programmed rules, was genuinely revolutionary. Then, in 1969, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert published a book called Perceptrons that landed like a bomb on the field. The book demonstrated severe mathematical limitations of single-layer perceptrons. Specifically, it showed that certain simple problems, like computing the XOR function, a basic logical operation, couldn't be solved by perceptrons with only one layer of adjustable connections. Multi-layer networks could solve these problems, but Minsky and Papert implied, somewhat unfairly, that multi-layer networks would be impractical. The book's impact was devastating. Funding for neural network research largely evaporated. Researchers who had been working on neural approaches moved to other areas. For more than a decade, neural networks were considered a dead end, a promising idea that had been mathematically proven to be inadequate. Rosenblatt himself died in a boating accident in 1971, at the age of 43, and didn't live to see his ideas vindicated. But they weren't dead. A few researchers kept working quietly, refining the mathematics, developing new architectures. And in the 1980s, a technique called backpropagation was developed that allowed multi-layer neural networks to learn. To understand backpropagation, imagine a network with layers of artificial neurons. You feed an input through the network, say an image, and the network produces an output, say a label. If the label is wrong, the algorithm measures how wrong it was. Then it traces backward through the network,
layer by layer, calculating how much each connection between neurons contributed to the error. Each connection has a weight, a number that determines how strongly one neuron influences another. The algorithm adjusts each weight by a tiny amount, nudging it in the direction that would reduce the error. The adjustments are small, barely perceptible for any single example. But do this thousands or millions of times with thousands or millions of different examples, and the network gradually tunes itself. The connections that lead to correct answers get stronger. The connections that lead to wrong answers get weaker. The network is, in a very real sense, carving pathways through its own structure, building an internal map of the patterns in the data. And here's what makes this so different from everything that came before in computing. In traditional programming, a human writes the rules. The programmer decides the logic.
The machine follows orders. With neural networks, the human provides examples, and the machine discovers the rules on its own. You don't tell the network what a cat looks like. You show it 10,000 pictures labeled cat and 10,000 pictures labeled not cat. And the network figures out, through millions of tiny weight adjustments, what features distinguish cats from everything else. Nobody programs the feature detectors. They emerge from the training process. The network builds its own representation of catness, and that representation might involve features a human wouldn't think to look for. Geoffrey Hinton, a British-Canadian computer scientist who had studied at Cambridge and Edinburgh before moving to the University of Toronto, was one of the most persistent advocates for neural networks during the long winter when most of the field had abandoned them.
He kept refining the mathematics of backpropagation, publishing papers in journals that were often poorly cited, training graduate students who went on to become leaders in the field, and insisting, year after year, that neural networks would eventually work if given enough data and enough computing power. His colleagues in mainstream AI were largely skeptical. Neural networks had been tried, had been found wanting, and had been mathematically discredited by Minsky and Papert. Why keep beating a dead horse? Hinton kept going because he believed something that the critics didn't. He believed that the limitations Minsky and Papert had identified were specific to single-layer networks, and that deep networks, networks with many layers, would be qualitatively different. The challenge was making them learn efficiently.
Backpropagation, when applied to deep networks, tended to suffer from what's called the vanishing gradient problem. The error signals that guided learning would get weaker and weaker as they propagated backward through many layers, until the earliest layers barely learned at all. Hinton and his students spent years developing techniques to overcome this problem, and slowly, painstakingly, they made progress. And then, three things happened at once in the 2000s that changed everything. The first was data. The internet, social media, smartphones and digital sensors were generating oceans of it. Billions of images, billions of texts, billions of data points of every kind. Neural networks are hungry for data. The more examples you show them, the better they learn. Suddenly, there was more data available than anyone had ever imagined. The second was computing power.
Specifically, the discovery that graphics processing units, GPUs, originally designed to render video game graphics, were extraordinarily good at the kind of parallel mathematical operations that neural networks require. A GPU can perform thousands of matrix multiplications simultaneously, and matrix multiplication is the core mathematical operation inside a neural network. Training networks that would have taken months on conventional processors could be done in days on GPUs. The third was algorithmic breakthroughs. Deeper networks with many layers of neurons proved capable of learning increasingly abstract representations. The first layer might learn to detect edges in an image. The second layer combines edges into shapes. The third combines shapes into parts of objects. The fourth recognizes whole objects. This hierarchical learning, from simple features to complex concepts, is called deep learning.
In 2012, a deep neural network called AlexNet, built by Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and Jeffrey Hinton, won the ImageNet competition, a major benchmark for image recognition, by a margin that stunned the field. It wasn't incrementally better than previous approaches, it was dramatically better. From that moment, deep learning swept through artificial intelligence like a wave. Within a few years, neural networks were matching or exceeding human performance at image recognition, speech recognition, language translation, and game playing. In 2016, DeepMind's AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in history, in a 5-game match in Seoul. Go is a game so complex that the number of possible board positions exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. For decades, experts had confidently predicted that mastering Go was at least 20 years away, probably more.
The game requires intuition, pattern recognition, and a kind of aesthetic judgment that seemed uniquely human. Professional Go players describe their craft in almost mystical terms, speaking of shape and thickness and flow. AlphaGo did it by combining deep neural networks with a technique called reinforcement learning. First, it was trained on millions of games played by human experts, learning to predict what a strong player would do in any given position. Then it played against itself millions of times, refining its strategy through trial and error. By the time it faced Lee Sedol, it had discovered moves and strategies that no human player had ever conceived of in thousands of years of play. During the second game, AlphaGo played a move, Move 37, that stunned the commentators. No human player would have made that move. It violated established Go wisdom. The experts watching live thought it was a mistake. But as the game progressed, it became clear that Move 37 was brilliant, a deeply creative play that reshaped the entire board in AlphaGo's favor. Lee Sedol left the room for 15 minutes to compose himself. He went on to lose the game and the match, though he won one game by finding a weakness in AlphaGo's play that the machine hadn't encountered in its training. That single move, Move 37, carries enormous weight in the conversation we've been following tonight. It loops all the way back to two of our opening questions at once. Because if a machine can produce a move that surprises every human expert, a move that even its own creators didn't anticipate, a move that the watching world called creative and beautiful, then what exactly do we mean by originate? What exactly did Ada Lovelace mean when she said the engine had no pretensions to originate anything? And then came the large language models.
In 2017, researchers at Google published a paper called "Attention is All You Need," introducing a neural network architecture called the Transformer. It was designed for processing sequences of text, and it turned out to be extraordinarily powerful. The key idea in the Transformer is a mechanism called attention, which allows the model to focus on different parts of the input when producing each part of the output. When you read a sentence, the meaning of each word depends on context. The word bank means something different in riverbank and bank account. The attention mechanism lets the model weigh the relevance of every other word in the sequence when processing any given word, learning which relationships matter and which don't.
By training transformer models on vast amounts of text from the internet, books, articles, code repositories, and conversations, essentially a significant fraction of everything humanity has ever written, these models learn to generate coherent, contextually appropriate language. They learn the relationships between words, the structure of sentences, the patterns of reasoning that appear in text. They learn that king is related to queen in the same way man is related to woman. They learn that Paris is to France what Tokyo is to Japan. They learn the rhythms of legal language and the conventions of poetry and the syntax of Python code and the structures of mathematical proofs. They learned all of this not because anyone programmed these relationships in, but because the patterns were there in the data, and the training process found them. GPT-2,
released by OpenAI in 2019, could write passable essays and stories.
GPT-3 in 2020 was dramatically more capable. And by late 2022, ChatGPT brought the technology to the general public, and millions of people suddenly realized that something fundamental had shifted. Here was a system you could have a conversation with. You could ask it questions, request explanations, ask it to write code or poetry or legal briefs, and it would respond in ways that felt remarkably human. You could ask it to explain quantum mechanics to a 5-year-old, and it would simplify accordingly. You could ask it to debug a piece of software, and it would identify the error and suggest a fix. You could ask it to write a sonnet about loneliness, and it would produce something that, while perhaps not Shakespeare, would have recognizable emotional texture and formal structure. It wasn't always correct. It wasn't always reliable. Sometimes it was subtly wrong in ways that required expertise to detect.
Sometimes it was spectacularly wrong, confidently stating falsehoods with the same fluent authority it brought to truths. But the fluency itself, the coherence, the apparent understanding, was astonishing. Millions of people interacted with it in its first weeks and came away unsettled, amazed, or both. And this is where the conversation comes full circle. Back to Ada Lovelace, in 1843, writing that the engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can only do whatever we know how to order it to perform. Back to Turing, in 1950, asking whether machines can think. Back to every link in this long chain of questions and answers. Because here is the honest truth. We don't fully understand what these models are doing. We know the architecture, we know the training process, we know the mathematics. But the internal representations, the way a model with hundreds of billions of parameters organizes its knowledge, that remains largely opaque.
These models produce outputs that look like understanding. They answer questions, summarize documents, write code, solve problems. But whether they understand in any meaningful sense, whether there is something it is like to be a large language model, whether Ada Lovelace's objection still holds or whether it has been quietly overturned by sufficient scale and data, these are questions we cannot yet answer. What we can say is this: the conversation that began with scratches on bone 20,000 years ago, that passed through abacuses and astrolabes and mechanical looms, through the dreams of Babbage and the vision of Lovelace, through Boole's algebra and Shannon's circuits and Turing's proof and von Neumann's architecture, through vacuum tubes and transistors and integrated circuits, through programming languages and operating systems, through networks and protocols and web pages, that conversation has arrived at a point where machines produce output that, if a human produced it, we would unhesitatingly call intelligent. Whether the machines are actually intelligent or merely performing an extraordinarily convincing simulation of intelligence is a question the conversation has not yet answered. It may be the question that defines the next chapter. So here you are, lying in the dark, or drifting toward it, and the device that brought you this story is running on principles laid down by every person we've talked about tonight. The binary logic in its processor traces back to George Boole in 1854. The architecture of its stored program design traces back to Alan Turing in 1936 and John von Neumann in 1945. Its transistors descend from Bardeen, Bratton, and Shockley's 1947 invention. Its integrated circuits come from Kilby and Noyce in 1958. Its programming languages carry the legacy of Grace Hopper and John Backus. Its network connectivity rests on the protocols of Cerf and Kahn, on the web built by Berners-Lee, on the search algorithms of Page and Brin. And the conversation hasn't stopped. Right now,
engineers are pushing against the physical limits of silicon, building transistors so small that quantum effects start to interfere with their operation.
Electrons tunnel through barriers they shouldn't be able to cross. The neat, reliable binary of 1 or 0 gets blurry at the scale of individual atoms. The response is coming from multiple directions at once. Three-dimensional chip stacking, layering transistors vertically instead of just spreading them across a flat surface. New materials like graphene and carbon nanotubes that might eventually replace silicon. And quantum computing, a fundamentally different approach that uses quantum mechanical effects, superposition and entanglement, not as problems to be overcome, but as resources to be exploited. A quantum bit, a qubit, can exist in a superposition of 0 and 1 simultaneously. Where a classical bit is always one thing or the other, a qubit holds both possibilities at once until it's measured. And multiple qubits can be entangled, so that the state of one is instantaneously correlated with the state of another, regardless of the distance between them.
Quantum computers won't replace classical computers for most tasks. They're specialized tools, extraordinarily powerful for certain kinds of problems, searching large solution spaces, simulating quantum systems like molecular behavior for drug discovery, optimizing complex logistics, and perhaps most consequentially, breaking certain types of encryption. In 1994, mathematician Peter Shor discovered a quantum algorithm that could factor large numbers exponentially faster than the best-known classical algorithm. This matters because modern internet encryption, the security that protects your bank account, your medical records, your private communications, relies on the difficulty of factoring large numbers. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer running Shor's algorithm could break these encryption systems in hours, rather than the billions of years a classical computer would need. This is why governments and technology companies are urgently developing post-quantum cryptography, new encryption methods based on mathematical problems that remain hard even for quantum computers. Building reliable quantum computers is extraordinarily difficult because qubits are fragile. Any interaction with the environment, heat, vibration, electromagnetic noise, destroys the delicate quantum superposition, a process called decoherence. Current quantum processors have hundreds or thousands of physical qubits, but they're noisy, meaning errors accumulate faster than most useful computations can complete. Quantum error correction can address this, but it requires many physical qubits to encode each reliable, logical qubit. Current estimates suggest you might need 1 million or more physical qubits to run Shor's algorithm on numbers large enough to threaten real-world encryption. We're not there yet, but progress is accelerating. Meanwhile, the question of artificial intelligence remains wide open. Current AI systems are pattern recognition at enormous scale. They're statistical machines that learn correlations in data. They're extraordinarily capable at specific tasks, but they lack common sense. They can't reliably distinguish truth from plausible-sounding fabrication, and they have no understanding of the physical world beyond what's implicit in the text and images they were trained on. Whether scaling up current approaches will eventually produce genuine understanding, or whether something fundamentally new is needed, no one knows. Some researchers believe we're on a path to artificial general intelligence, machines that can match or exceed human cognitive abilities across any domain. Others believe there's a qualitative gap between what neural networks do and what human minds do, a gap that might not be bridgeable through more data and bigger models alone. Roger Penrose, the mathematical physicist, argued in his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, that human mathematical insight involves non-computable processes, that consciousness might depend on quantum effects in the brain that no classical computer can replicate. This remains deeply controversial. Most cognitive scientists disagree. But the fact that the question is still genuinely open, almost 90 years after Turing posed it, tells you something about how deep it runs. And there's an even stranger idea at the edges of the conversation. The physicist John Wheeler spent the later part of his career arguing for what he called it from bit, the proposition that at the most fundamental level, Physical reality itself might emerge from information. Not that the universe is like a computer in some loose, metaphorical sense, but that information might be more physically fundamental than matter or energy. If this is true, and it remains speculative, then computer science isn't just a tool for understanding computation. It's a tool for understanding reality itself. And there's one more figure from this conversation who deserves a quiet moment in the closing. Claude Shannon, the same young man who connected Boole's logic to electrical circuits in 1937, went on to do something else in 1948 that was just as transformative. He published a paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication, and in it, he essentially invented the science of information. Shannon showed that information could be measured, quantified, expressed as a number. He defined the basic unit of information as the bit, a single binary choice, yes or no, 1 or 0. He proved that any message, any signal, any form of communication could be encoded in bits. And he showed that there were fundamental limits to how much information could be transmitted reliably over a noisy channel, and that by adding the right kind of redundancy, you could approach those limits while keeping errors vanishingly small. Shannon's work is why your music streams clearly, why your video calls don't dissolve into static, why files arrive intact after traveling through thousands of miles of cable and air. Every time data moves from one place to another in the modern world, it's moving according to principles Shannon laid down in a single paper, written in the same Bell Labs where the transistor was being developed one floor away. Shannon was also famously playful. He built machines that did nothing useful, including a box with a switch on top. When you flipped the switch, the box would open. A mechanical hand would reach out, flip the switch back off, and the hand would retract, and the box would close. He called it the ultimate machine.
He rode unicycles through the hallways at Bell Labs and juggled while riding them. He built a flame-throwing trumpet. He approached information, the most abstract and consequential concept in modern technology, with the spirit of someone who simply found the universe delightful and couldn't stop playing with it. That spirit, the spirit of play, of curiosity for its own sake, of asking questions because the questions are interesting rather than because the answers are profitable, runs through the entire conversation. Boole wasn't trying to build digital electronics. Turing wasn't trying to build computers. Shannon wasn't trying to build the internet. They were playing with ideas, following the logic wherever it led, and the practical consequences came later. Often much later, often in ways they never imagined. But those are questions for another night. Tonight, the conversation can rest. Think about the arc of it for a moment. Just let the shape of it settle into your mind.
20,000 years, from notches on bone to neural networks that write poetry. From a shepherd counting sheep on his fingers to machines that can hold a conversation. From Leibniz dreaming of a calculus of thought to Boole formalizing it. From Shannon making it electrical to Turing proving its limits. From von Neumann making it practical to Hopper making it accessible. From Wozniak making it personal to Berners-Lee making it universal. Each person in that chain answered a question they inherited from someone who came before. And each one left behind a new question for someone who hadn't arrived yet. Many of them never knew about each other. Boole didn't know his algebra would become the foundation of digital electronics. Babbage didn't know that his analytical engine would be vindicated a century after his death. Turing didn't know that his abstract thought experiment, his imaginary tape and reading head, would become the theoretical framework for billions of machines carrying billions of people through their daily lives. The conversation was carried by people who often couldn't see where it was going. They just knew they had a question that needed answering, and they worked on it with whatever tools they had. Sometimes the answer came quickly. Sometimes it took a century. Sometimes it came from a completely unexpected direction, from a loom, from a genetics metaphor, from a graduate student's thesis. And the conversation is still going. Right now, Someone is working on a problem that will produce the next question, the one we can't anticipate yet, the one that will seem obvious in hindsight, but is invisible today.
Somewhere, in a lab or a garage or a dorm room, someone is puzzling over something that doesn't quite work, something that doesn't quite make sense, and they're about to have an insight that will add a new link to the chain. That's how this story has always worked, not as a grand plan, not as an inevitable march from primitive to sophisticated, but as a conversation. Slow, halting, sometimes stuck for decades or centuries, sometimes leaping forward in a single paper or a single thesis or a single afternoon of inspiration. Carried by people who were mostly just trying to solve the problem in front of them, without knowing that their solution would become someone else's question. And this brings us back to where we started, to that glass rectangle near your hand. It's a physical object you can hold. But what it contains is not physical in any obvious sense. What it contains is layers. Layers of abstraction so deep and so numerous that no single person comprehends them all.
At the bottom, quantum mechanics governing the behavior of electrons in silicon. Above that, transistors carved into chips using techniques that involve some of the most precise manufacturing processes ever devised. Above that, logic gates performing Boolean operations. Above that, a processor executing instructions. Above that, an operating system managing resources. Above that, application software. Above that, a network stack connecting this device to billions of others. Above that, the audio stream carrying my voice to your ears. Each layer rests on the one below it. Each layer was built by people who understood their own layer deeply and trusted the layers below to work as promised. The person who wrote the app you're using tonight probably doesn't know how transistors work. The person who designed the transistors probably doesn't know how the app works. And that's fine. That's the point. Abstraction means you don't need to understand everything to build on top of it. And you are living in the accumulated answers. Every time you pick up your phone, you're holding the condensed legacy of thousands of people across more than 1,000 years. The glass and metal in your hand contains ideas from ancient Mesopotamia, medieval Baghdad, Victorian England, wartime Bletchley Park, a cramped lab at Bell Labs in New Jersey, a garage in Los Altos, California, and a physics laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland. It contains the stubbornness of Babbage, the vision of Lovelace, the precision of Boole, the playfulness of Shannon, the lonely brilliance of Turing, the practical genius of von Neumann, the tenacity of Hopper, the ambition of Jobs and Gates, the generosity of Berners-Lee, and the patience of Hinton. It's all there, layer upon layer, each one resting on everything that came before. And it works. It works because each generation built carefully on what the previous one had left behind. Because standards were agreed upon. Because failures were studied.
Because somewhere, someone always cared enough to get the details right. So as you lie there, maybe drifting, maybe already half asleep, let that thought settle. You're resting in a world shaped by a conversation that spans 20,000 years. The bone carver and the bead slider and the loom weaver and the gear maker and the logician and the code breaker and the chip designer and the software engineer and the network builder. They're all part of the same long story. And the story is still being written. Question by unanswered question, each one a gift to someone who hasn't arrived yet. But that's for tomorrow. For now, the machines will keep humming quietly in their data centers. The signals will keep bouncing between satellites and towers and undersea cables. The bits will keep flowing, ones and zeros,
the ancient language of switches, the binary heartbeat of a world built from patterns. And you don't need to think about any of it. You can just rest. Let the conversation continue without you for a few hours. Let the signals keep traveling. Let the switches keep flipping. Let the layers of abstraction do their quiet work. The conversation will be there when you wake. It always is. Sleep